All right, my Verizon phone tells me it's right at 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Welcome everyone to our workshop on restoration of isolated wetlands in the Bladen Lakes region. We're really happy that all of you are joining us today. We have a really nice lineup of various folks to speak to us today on lots of different topics. Our first workshop that we did in this lineup was in 2019. We did one of these in the Sandhills, focused on essentially the same topic. One of the things that prompted some of this interest in having a workshop is how many imperiled reptiles and amphibians live in these systems. But there really are many different species, lots of plants, lots of invertebrates, birds and mammals as well, fishes, everything. Lots of different things use these isolated wetlands. So we certainly have broadened our topic quite a bit to include a lot of the different plants and animals that use these unique wetland types. My name is Jeff Hall, and I work with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. I'm a herpetologist there, and I work in a statewide capacity. So I spend my time driving all around the state, working with the various species. I have three partners in crime that are here today on the webinar, and I will let them just real quickly introduce themselves. I'll call on you, and then you can introduce yourself. So I'll go with Julian Wilson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julian Wilson. I work for the North Carolina Forest Service. I am the Longleaf Program Coordinator, so a lot of my work is in the coastal plain and some of the Piedmont, although I do have a few other projects I'm working on related to prescribed fire that's more statewide.
Awesome. Jeff Marcus.
Afternoon, everyone. Jeff Marcus. I'm an applied scientist with the Nature Conservancy's Longleaf Program, based out of Moore County, but work throughout southeastern North Carolina.
And Sarah.
Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Hecox. I'm a Sandhills Conservation Fellow. I work with mainly the Nature Conservancy and U.S. Fish and Wildlife in the Sandhills and also a little bit west into the Uaris.
Wonderful. And we certainly don't want to forget our partners with NC State Cooperative Extension and Bob Barden, who helped us set up many of the pieces of this webinar that we're sharing today. So those are the main players that helped sort of put this on to today and for some of the field trip that some of you will be participating in tomorrow. I do have a couple of polls, just sort of start us off in a participatory mode. So I'm going to launch these, and you are welcome to go ahead and click an answer that best represents you as those come up. And I will let the poll run for about a minute or so. And once I see we've got a majority of folks that are attending today, I will end it and I will share with everyone. So you can kind of see where people are coming from and who they are affiliated with and all those sorts of things. So we've got really good participation so far. Awesome from everyone. I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds and I'm going to end the poll. So a little bit longer, maybe not 30 seconds, maybe 10 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to end the poll and I'll share the results with everyone. So we have a nice representation across pretty much everything I put in here, state and federal, as well as nonprofits and private sector, sort of all in that sort of relatively equal bracket. And then we have the other and colleges and universities. So that's really good stuff. Awesome. All right. I have another poll that I want to share with you, slightly different one. This is where you're located. And I'm guessing I know that this is going to be heavily biased towards one region of the state, since we are talking about Bladen Lakes, but I'm curious to see where all everyone might be participating from today. And you can choose if you want to make this the area that you work in, even if you don't necessarily live there, that's also fine. And you'll notice I did break out Sandhills from coastal plain, although you could make the argument that they're just part of the coastal plain. But I did go ahead and break them out. And I'll give us just a few more seconds here. All right, I will end this poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's share the results. Lots of folks from the coastal plain, as you might expect, but pretty good representation from lots of places, even some folks joining us from the mountains. So thank you. And bring some of that weather, push it this way if you would. That'd be lovely. Get some mountain cool weather. It'd be nice. All right, and I have one final one I'm going to share. And this one is more of a conservation type topic. And so we'll see, what are your thoughts on these very different types of actions? Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to just choose one. I want to choose a lot of these. But I'm making you choose one. So you can only choose one. You can only put your dollars into one of these buckets. How do you want to participate? And yes, you could argue that several of these bleed into the other one, and one does affect another one. All those kinds of arguments are wonderful. Sounds like I'm arguing with myself even. All right, you guys are wonderful participants. We're getting really good participation in the polls, and I appreciate that. Makes it more fun. I'll give you about 5 more seconds. We have a clear leader in this category, which I had a feeling we might. 5, 4, 3. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And you're probably all shocked and amazed that land conservation was the one that actually trumped the day in this particular poll. Decent representation from these other 3, and a little bit of captive breeding and rearing. So definitely some different options out there in terms of conservation work that we could do. All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. And without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our first topic. And Jeff Marcus is going to talk to us about the importance of the Bladen Lakes region for wetland restoration and conservation. So Jeff, I'll let you take it away. Oh, one other thing while Jeff is preparing himself. As you have questions that might occur to you during presentations, feel free to put those into the chat. We'll try to monitor the chat, and as time allows, we may ask those questions to the presenters, or if we run out of time, they could potentially answer them in the chat. But feel free, as those questions hit you, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. Okay, thank you.
Jeff, are you seeing my my screen okay?
Sure I am. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks. So once again, I'm Jeff Marcus with the Nature Conservancy, and yeah, looking at the participant list, it's great to see several folks from the Bladen Lakes region who are here. Also seeing folks from elsewhere, and I think everyone who's participating will glean something from this. A lot of these principles and ideas are applicable across a lot of different regions and systems, but we wanted to have a particular focus on the Bladen Lakes region for this workshop. And so basically want to take a few moments at the beginning to kind of say why. What's so important, what's so special, why focus on Bladen Lakes. So the Bladen Lakes region, so I'm going to actually show you a series of some different, conservation prioritization maps that have been done. This is one that's widely used, the Biodiversity Wildlife Habitat Assessment developed by Natural Heritage. It considers multiple species and multiple habitats, and basically the more green, the green you see is the higher conservation priority. Those are less familiar. The Bladen Lakes region is this region right here, and you can see that it really does pop out with a lot of of high conservation value land identified in this analysis. This next one is the Nature Conservancy's Longleaf Resilience Roadmap. And this attempts to not show where all the longleaf is, but basically identify the places that have the sort of the largest, most resilient cores, the places that are most likely to sustain resilient longleaf communities, and how to connect them. And so once again, the Bladen Lakes region, you can see, is not only important as a core area in and of itself, but if you are hoping to have any type of habitat and genetic movement and connectivity for longleaf species across between the Sandhills and other kind of strongholds on the coast, it's got to go through the Bladen Lakes region. That's where it's at. And then if you want to look at where the actual longleaf is, this map shows it's kind of our best snapshot to date of the distribution of where longleaf pine forests are in North Carolina. This was compiled through a couple of sources, including the Longleaf Ecosystem Occurrences, or LEO database, that's some field-based surveys. And so all these polygons that you see denoted here are kind of known, confirmed, places with longleaf pine. And the scale there goes from red to green, is showing habitat quality. So the green, dark green is excellent, light green good, orange fair, and then to red. You can see some examples of what that might look like. It's a subjective assessment, essentially thinking from the perspective of longleaf specialist wildlife habitat, like a red-cockaded woodpecker, how good the habitat quality is. At any rate, as you can see from this map here, that the Bladen Lakes region, while it has a lot more longleaf than a lot of the other parts of the upper coastal plain, it's actually a little bit more scattered and fragmented than other places like the Sandhills or towards Lejeune, and a lot more variable in terms of habitat quality. There's a lot of that sort of fair and poor quality, and some of this relates to the management history and objectives, both of the conservation lands that a lot of them are sort of more recent acquisitions, and so the longer history there, as well as in the current private landscape. There's a lot of focus on either very intensive management for maximizing profit, or sort of no management at all, extremes in this landscape. So what has that meant for a lot of the species that we're concerned about that use these wetland systems? So in this next series of maps, we're going to be showing the natural heritage data that coded by, in this case, green are extant or current populations, or that have been seen recently enough, or data on sort of the persistence of the habitat on the places where these things were seen, and versus these red areas are places that there was a historic record. These species was known to have been there, but either confirmed to have been extirpated, the habitat lost, or species just hasn't been seen in a long time. So for ornate chorus frog, see actually not doing particularly well across most of the state, maybe exception of around Camp Lejeune, doing all right. In the Bladen Lakes region, several places where it has been lost, and there's maybe about 3 or 4 ponds, just a handful of sites where this species is still remaining in the Bladen Lakes region, and each of these populations relatively small. If we look at maybe salamander, we see almost an identical pattern to it. Have lost several populations, and just a handful of sites left in the Bladen Lakes area. Still there, but relatively few, relatively small populations. Pine Barrens tree frog. This is a species had a grad student came down several years ago, wanted to do a genetics study, and she visited most of these sites in the Bladen Lakes region and found that pretty much all of them were either badly fire suppressed or had been destroyed. Didn't find any frogs, with the one exception of an extant population on the edge of Suggs Mill Pond game land, right in an area near where they actually recently built a large solar farm. Next, southern hognose snake. Now, this is not strictly a wetland species. It's an upland living snake, but its diet is almost exclusively frogs and toads. So the health of this species is highly dependent upon having an abundance of healthy wetlands in the landscape, producing frogs and toads for food. So here you can see kind of the majority of the records are in the Sandhills. A relatively short drive from Jeff Bean's house, coincidentally. But Bladen Lakes, again, across most of Bladen County, Robson County, population has been lost. Interestingly, there is still a pretty good number of records shown of extant in southern Sampson, Bladen County. So they're still in that landscape in a very sort of localized way. Something that cannot be said for Carolina gopher frog, one of our highest priority conservation priorities in the state for amphibians. Used to occur at several sites in Bladen Lakes. Western knowledge is completely extirpated from from this region. And it's not just reptiles and amphibians. If you look at plants that are dependent upon fire-managed wetlands, you're seeing essentially the same pattern and the same story play out. In fact, if you stack all of these species I've talked about, plus a few of the upland longleaf species together, you get a pretty clear and distinct pattern that comes obvious. One is that most of the remaining, records and populations of these longleaf specialist species are really, restricted to the large fire-managed conservation lands or managed lands, including over here in Sandhills Game Land, Fort Bragg, Boiling Spring Lake, Matsu, and Holly Shelter, Lejeune, and the Croatan, and relatively few on private lands out there. If you look in the upper coastal plain, the sort of region between the extreme down coast and the Sandhills, actually, if you look at all this red, these are all records. So most of the heritage records date back about 40 or 50 years. That's about, and of course, long before that, these species were probably found all across the landscape. But even as recently as 40, 50 years ago, there were pretty good examples, of a lot of these species distributed fairly widely across the upper coastal plain. But currently, you look anywhere kind of northeast of Sampson County, pretty much everything is gone, extirpated. You look to the south, Robeson, Columbus, southern Bladen County, pretty much all of these are gone. And then if you look right here in that Bladen Lakes ridge, the Bladen kind of Sampson line, you have a lot of examples that have been lost, but still quite a few that are, or at least several that are hanging on, kind of small populations, small number of populations for a lot of these species that are still there. But there's reason for hope here. So one is that there's actually a lot of potential to manage for these species and for habitat in the region. The different colors on your screen here are different types of managed lands. There's actually 4 different types of state-owned lands, from Plant Conservation, Parks, Wildlife Commission, and Forest Service. There are several private lands with conservation easements, either NGO or federal conservation easements. There's initiatives to stand up a prescribed burn association, engage more private land. There's a lot of momentum and interest and potential in this landscape to be doing more. So as I leave you, what I want you to take away from this presentation. So the first takeaway is that it's not too late. In contrast to a lot of these other parts of the range where things have been lost, once you've lost these species, once they're extirpated, it's so much harder to get it back, not only to build back the habitat, but to find ways to sort of reintroduce and get populations reestablished. Much more challenging, more expensive. So where you still have them hanging on, it's much better to save them while you have it. So it's not too late, but our second takeaway is it's getting late. There's these populations are really on the brink. Several of them have just small number of individuals, extremely vulnerable from both sort of genetic standpoint and vulnerability to any type of disturbance. So those of us who care about the conservation of such species should feel a real sense of urgency of wanting and needing to do something now. It's not hyperbole or unrealistic thinking that, if we decide to wait 2 or 3 years to get started on doing something, that at least one of these species could also be lost in this region. That we are on the brink. So I hope that each of you will come away from the presentation today with some ideas of what to do and a real sort of call to arms and a call to action to make something happen on the ground. And to hear how we're going to learn about that, or examples of what's been done elsewhere, I'll turn it back to Jeff Hall and the rest of the agenda.
Wonderful. Perfect setting of the stage, Jeff. So appreciate you doing that. And because we have to apparently have 3 Jeffs speak in a row, our next speaker is Jeff Bean from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of those herpetofauna that we saw in Jeff Marcus's talk, or the reptiles and amphibians. So Jeff, I'll invite you to, I gotta let you, let's see, now you can unmute yourself. I have to remember to allow you to do that. And then you can share your screen, Jeff Bean.
Everybody see that?
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Zoom.
Remember, start from the Zoom window. There we go.
See it now?
Yep. Yep, you're good.
Good. Thanks, everybody. Yes, I did name this after the Warren Zevon song. Ephemeral wetlands, you know what they are. They're wetlands that only hold water part of the time. There are many different types. They have many different names depending on the type. You could even say that no two are alike. They all have in common that they dry up periodically, most likely during the warm, dry summer months. And they have many, many functions, some of which even benefit the very egocentric primate known as the human directly. But I'm going to talk mostly today about their importance to biodiversity and specifically to amphibians and reptiles that use them. In North Carolina, there are over 40 amphibian species that have been known to breed in or otherwise inhabit ephemeral wetlands, and more than half of these are heavily dependent on them. Probably at least 14 and maybe more are just about entirely dependent upon them. And one you hear about quite often is the gopher frog. It sort of epitomizes the example of a species that's a specialist that needs a certain type of ephemeral wetland in the longleaf pine ecosystem. They need ponds that are deep enough to hold water for their breeding season, and they need lots of upland habitat around there. Gopher frogs, nobody was talking about gopher frogs 30 or 40 years ago, but let something just about disappear and then people start jumping on the bandwagon and talking about them, and people are finally paying attention when it's almost too late. I've got sound bites on here. I'll see if they work. Can y'all hear that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. The ornate coarse frog is another species that's pretty much in the same boat as the gopher frog, even though it's a really different species. These things were so abundant in some places 30, 40 years ago that it would have been hard for you to convince me then that they would be one of the first amphibians we might lose in the state. But they're even worse off than gopher frogs in a few sites, and there's still a few places, very few places where they're hanging on, as Jeff Marcus mentioned earlier. Ornate coarse frogs like the gopher frog are winter breeders. Sometimes these guys will breed in the fall. Gopher frogs also after hurricanes or very heavy rains, but most of the time they're breeding between about the ornate coarse frog between January and March, the gopher frog between about February and April, but occasionally they will breed in the fall. They use pretty much the same kind of ponds as the gopher frogs do, but the difference is they're very short-lived animals. They'll live maybe 2 or 3 years, whereas the gopher frogs can live 10 years or more. And a couple of years of drought and the population's completely gone. They come in many different colors. They sound like that. You should hear my sound bite of the tiger salamander. It's very, very quiet. You have to listen very carefully. Salamanders don't make any sound. Tiger salamander is another species that's a longleaf pine specialist. They use the same kinds of places that the gopher frogs and the ornate coarse frogs do. They'll use some places that are a little bit smaller than either of those two species need. And they're also fall and winter breeders. They're our largest terrestrial salamander. And all these species pretty much in the same boat. They've been hammered in terms of their terrestrial habitat and their breeding habitat. They need really good, high quality longleaf pine with good ephemeral ponds in them in order to survive, and they can't survive anywhere else. Maybe salamander is another species. These will sometimes use smaller wetlands than the tiger salamanders will. They lay their eggs singly, attaching them to leaves or in very small strings of up to 2 to 6 instead of laying an egg mass. And they breed about the same time of year, fall and winter, named for the entomologist Bill Mabey, who collected the type specimen. Oak toad is another a longleaf pine specialist that uses ephemeral wetlands, and these guys have really plummeted. All these species have declined precipitously in the last few decades in North Carolina. Oak toads were super common back in the 60s and 70s, and now they're pretty hard to come by in a lot of places. They sound, if I can get the sound button, there it goes. My screen's in the way of my sound bite. Some people say they sound like Easter chicks. I say Easter chicks sound like them because they were here a lot longer ago. They were here first. It's our smallest buffonid, our smallest toad. Mole salamander is another species that uses ephemeral wetlands. These guys will sometimes use wetlands with fish in them. They're a strange animal in North Carolina. They're found in the Piedmont and the mountains. In South Carolina, they're only in the coastal plain. We don't have them in the coastal plain in North Carolina, just Piedmont and mountains. And all the Ambystoma are temporary pond breeders. The tiger and the maybes are longleaf specialists. These guys use longleaf in South Carolina, but not in North Carolina. Southern chorus frog is another species that was very common just a few years ago, and it's been disappearing from places where it used to occur. All the same thing, it's all habitat loss pretty much. Put the wood frog in because it uses ephemeral ponds. It's not a longleaf species. It doesn't occur in the coastal plain except up in the Albemarle Peninsula. There are or were a few relic populations, probably holdovers from the last ice age. They haven't been found there in several years now, and there's fear that they may not be there anymore. Otherwise, this is a mountain and western Piedmont species, but they do use ephemeral wetlands and depend on them. Wood frogs are really explosive breeders. Their whole breeding season might be just a couple of weeks. They'll come in the ponds and breed and leave, and they sound like this. You almost never hear just one wood frog calling. It's always a big chorus. Four-toed salamander is another species that uses isolated wetlands. These guys breed in seepage ponds and woodland pools. They'll lay their eggs in hummocks of either moss or sedges, and they'll remain with the eggs until they hatch. Usually they're breeding about middle of February to about the middle of March, sometimes late April in the mountains. They're probably found in just about every county, but they're not super common anywhere, and they're very easily overlooked, very secretive, very small salamanders as adults. They're the only salamander we have with a white belly with obvious dark spots. They also have a little constriction at the base of their tail, and that tail will snap off easily if you pick them up by the tail. And they have 4 toes on their hind foot. Most salamanders have 5. Spotted salamander are not longleaf specialists by any means. They occur in the mountains in Piedmont primarily, a few places in the coastal plain, but they depend on temporary woodland pools also. And they lay a very large, very thick egg mass. They're the largest, thickest egg mass of any of our amphibians. It swells to the size of a softball, and it has very thick jelly that protects the eggs from the cold. These guys breed between about January and March. Marbled salamander is our state salamander. It's found just about all over the state, although it's pretty rare in the mountains. These guys, instead of the usual method of laying their eggs in the water, they lay their eggs on land in the woodland depressions and pools that will later fill with rainwater, and they will remain with their eggs until they hatch or until the rains flood them. That way they get a jump on the other things. They will be eating the spotted salamander larvae when they hatch. This is one of the salamanders that's sexually dimorphic. The males are much more brightly colored, tend to be boldly contrasting black and white, and the females more of a silvery or gray. Very pretty salamander. Spadefoots are a species that can breed in just about any kind of ephemeral wetland, from mud puddles and flooded ruts in fields to high quality ephemeral ponds. And they are very highly adapted to wetlands that dry up very quickly. Their larvae can go from egg to a little toad stage in about 2 weeks. Archie Carr said they could do it in 6 days, but I have a hard time believing that. Sometimes it takes them longer depending on the resources, but they get in and out of the pond very quickly. Their call is said to resemble the sound of a duck being strangled, but I think it's a very beautiful call. I love tear and spadefoots. And these guys will breed almost any time of year if there's enough rain. Most of their breeding is between early spring, late winter to early spring and late summer, but they'll breed just about any time there's a heavy enough rain. Spend the rest of their time underground, very seldom coming to the surface. Cope's gray tree frog is found just about statewide, and it's a very common species, and that's because it can use just about any kind of ephemeral wetland. They'll even breed in little kiddie pools and backyard bird baths, rain barrels, any place that holds water temporarily they'll use, and their eggs are a surface mass. You've probably seen them, and I know you've heard them. Pinewoods tree frog is the one that sounds like Morse code. Pinewoods tree frogs are very acid tolerant. Their tadpoles can survive a pH of about 4, and they can breed in a wide variety of ephemeral wetlands, but they're pretty heavily tied to the longleaf pine forest. Unlike a lot of the other species, they're still very common because they can use just flooded roadside ditches in places that are too acidic or too small and ephemeral for a lot of the other species. So they're still doing pretty well, but they're very ephemeral wetland dependent. Barking tree frogs are our largest tree frog species. And this is one species. There's several species here that will sometimes use permanent wetlands or wetlands that have fish, but they do much better if they're in high quality fishless ephemeral wetlands. Barking tree frogs sound somewhat like a dog barking. You can hear some cricket frogs in the background there. This is probably my favorite tree frog species. They have a lot of personality, and they will move great distances to get to their breeding sites, sometimes several miles. They can cover a lot of ground on a rainy night. Squirrel tree frog is another species that's still very common because it uses a great variety of ephemeral wetlands. They'll breed in roadside puddles, ditches, places like that, named for their resemblance of their call to a scolding gray squirrel. These are also the best color changers among our amphibians. They can go from brown to bright green and back, sort of like an anole or a chameleon or these other creatures that change their color. Very variable. Brimley's chorus frogs, a species we have out on the outer coastal plain, used to be found further inland. It's disappearing from some of the sites in the intercoastal plain and sandhills. It likes big marshy wetlands. You can hear these guys breeding out on the Albemarle Peninsula in the winter in the big flooded roadside ditches. Named for C.S. Brimley, our early herpetologist who helped found our institution long ago. Spring peeper is a species everybody's familiar with. They're not so often seen, but very often heard. They can be kind of deafening. I've been in wetlands with peepers where it felt like ice picks in my ears. It was so loud. These are very common too, and they are able to use a great variety of wetlands, including some that are associated with permanent water. But mostly they'll use just about any kind of bottom land that holds water, and not restricted, but still very dependent on ephemeral wetlands. The same thing with the upland chorus frog, which is sort of the Piedmont version of the southern chorus frog. This says cannot play media for whatever reason. Anyway, they sound like a thumbnail being dragged across the teeth of a comb, somewhat similar to the southern chorus frog that I played earlier. And these guys are common in the Piedmont and foothills. Little grass frog, if you can't hear these calling, you're probably over 50. Their call is very faint, and a lot of people lose that range of their hearing. They have a very insect-like call. This is our North America's smallest native amphibian. Unless you count weight, gravid females are heavier than some of the tiny salamanders are, but as far as snout vent length goes, they're our tiniest amphibian. And they are also associated with the coastal plain and the longleaf system. They're doing a little better than some of the other species because they can breed in tire ruts, puddles, and roadside ditches and places like that. Neat little guys. I like to call these narrow-minded toads. They are also heavily dependent on ephemeral wetlands and still doing fairly well, fairly common. They're found not just in the coastal plain, but also in the Piedmont and a few places in the southern mountains. Their call is also one of my favorite. These guys have a secretion that sticks them together when they're in amplexus, so they're hard to pull apart, almost like crazy glue. And they're easily identified by the fold of skin across the top of their head and the lack of a tympanum and their little pointy noses and football shapes and their call. Put the pine barrens tree frog in here because it uses kind of a different kind of ephemeral wetlands. It uses more of a bay heads and seepage pools, places like that that have some seepage or sometimes in some cases are spring fed. It doesn't use, but a lot of their ponds do dry up periodically. They're our North Carolina's official state frog. And some people think the prettiest frog in the state, but also another very, very habitat specific animal, closely tied to the longleaf system like a lot of these species are. There are many other species that use ephemeral wetlands, but don't absolutely depend on them. Both species of siren, and especially the lesser siren, are often found in ephemeral wetlands. Both of the newt subspecies, the eastern red spotted and the broken stripe, particularly the broken stripes, do a lot better in ephemeral wetlands than they do in fishless wetlands, although they will use them. Amphibians are typically swamp animals, but they will use Carolina bays and other ephemeral wetlands. Both of the dwarf salamander species, the dwarf salamander and Chamberlain's dwarf salamander, particularly the dwarf salamander, which we used to call the silver-bellied form, it uses clay-based Carolina bays pretty frequently in North Carolina. It's pretty uncommon animal here. The Chamberlain's is more common in the Piedmont, but both of these will use ephemeral wetlands from time to time. And lots of other frogs will use them, but don't depend on them, including the American toad, Fowler's toad, the southern toad, the northern and the southern cricket frogs, the green tree frog, the southern leopard frog, carpenter frog, the pickerel frog, the green frog, and the good old bullfrog. A lot of these do better in permanent wetlands, but they will use ephemeral wetlands a lot of the time if they're available. Some of them do better in ephemeral wetlands than they do, even though they don't depend on them. As far as reptiles go, in North Carolina, over 18 species are known to inhabit ephemeral wetlands, but there are very few entirely dependent on them. One that is pretty heavily dependent is the chicken turtle. These are very bizarre turtles. They're just made for large ephemeral wetlands, very, very heavily adapted to drought. They lay their eggs usually in the winter. They're the only turtle that I know of that can sometimes overwinter as eggs. We've got records of them nesting in January, and the eggs spend all winter and then hatch sometime in the spring or summer. I've radio tracked a lot of these turtles, and I had 3 of them that spent a year or more buried in the sand in the uplands when their ponds were dry. One of them spent nearly 2 years underground. And when they did move, they moved to permanent water instead of back to the ephemeral pond. They can move back and forth, but they're very short-lived turtles. They're probably 8 or 10 years is a good lifespan for them. Almost everything about them is unusual, but they're very well adapted to large ephemeral wetlands within the longleaf system. I threw the bog turtle in here. It's obviously not found in the longleaf system or in the coastal plain. It's a mountain and Piedmont species, but it does use isolated wetlands. Some of the wetlands it uses are ephemeral, at least to a point. It uses all the bog turtle wetlands in North Carolina are spring fed. They all have springs, and their quality depends largely on the quality of those springs. But in droughts, the sites can dry up to nearly nothing. They use open canopy spring fed sedge meadow wetlands, very unique wetlands, very unique species. A couple of other reptiles that are commonly found in ephemeral wetlands but don't depend on them are the spotted turtle and the glossy crayfish snake. And there are many others that use them frequently but don't depend on them. Turtles that often use ephemeral wetlands opportunistically include the yellow-bellied slider, eastern mud turtle, striped mud turtle, river cooter, eastern painted turtle, and the snapping turtle. And the American alligator, which is not a turtle, by the way, also uses ephemeral wetlands from time to time. Many of the aquatic, semi-aquatic snakes, the eastern ribbon snake, the black swamp snake, the mud and the rainbow snake, all of the Nerodia except the brown water snake, we frequently use ephemeral wetlands. Browns are more commonly tied to permanent water, but the other three, the banded, the northern, and the red-bellied, will frequently use ephemeral wetlands. We're talking with this workshop or webinar mostly about wetlands within the longleaf pine system. And the longleaf pine, of course, is a fire-dependent system that historically burned about every 1 to 3 years, depending on who you ask and depending on the region of the country and the type of longleaf. Lightning was the primary ignition source, probably the only ignition source originally. And longer fire return intervals result in major ecological shifts, including increase in woody shrubs and trees, decrease in grasses, herbs, and forbs, and overall decrease in biodiversity. These examples are from Florida, happen to be from Florida, but the same thing's true here. The more fire suppressed, the more woody trees and shrubs you get encroaching on this system. Sure you've all seen this before. The longleaf pine system once ranged from Virginia to Texas at about 90-some million acres, and about 97% of that is gone now. Maybe 3 million acres at the most remain today, and it's largely fragmented. It's an Ice Age origin system shaped over many, many thousands of years by frequent low-intensity surface fires that were originally set by lightning. The Native Americans recognized fire as a valuable management tool, and they set deliberate fires for a very, very long time. Then DeSoto and his boys discovered the country in the early 1500s, and there goes the neighborhood. By the early 1900s, over 90% of it was gone. What happened to it? You know what happened to it. Many, many things. It was hit for many, many reasons, timbering and turpentining and clearing for agriculture, especially King Cotton after the Civil War. But you may not know that even as early as the 1500s, the longleaf began to decline because we either slaughtered the Native Americans intentionally or by the diseases we brought over here so that we could take their land and live here. And they no longer were able to set fires at that point. Feral hogs also did a huge amount of damage as early as the 1500s when they were introduced, before all this other stuff happened and Smokey Bear said not to set fires. And by the 1920s, the last virgin longleaf forests were cut. And this is pretty much what we have left. This one's my favorite. It's a beautiful rendition of a longleaf pine. The artist obviously very familiar with that plant. The word salamander means fire dweller. And you think, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. There's nothing further from a fire dweller than a salamander. But that originated from an old European myth when they would throw logs on the fire and the European salamander would crawl out. Of course, it would instantly die and burn, but they still thought it was going back to the fire where it came from. That's where the name came from. But amphibians really do need fire. They just need the right kind of fire and the right frequency of fire. This is a map showing the flash density, the lightning frequency in the US. And not surprisingly, the highest density, which is the pink, the red, and the orange, occurs right where the longleaf pine belt is. Here's another map showing the frequency of rainfall and thunderstorms and when lightning fires would normally occur. And surprise, surprise, they would mostly occur between May and early September, nearly all of them. Lightning fires in the winter are a very, very rare thing historically. What do people do now? For many, many years, landowners recognized the value of fire for land management, but they would always set those fires in the winter because it was easier to control them. It's much easier to burn in the winter. This is a chart that pertains to the frosted flatwood salamander, Ambismus cingulatum, which doesn't occur in North Carolina, but the same general principle is true. These guys are migrating to the ponds in the fall. They're laying their eggs in the late fall and winter, and the larvae have transformed and are out of the ponds by April. None of this is fire season. The fire season is when these guys are not on the surface. So finally, people have begun to figure out winter fires are not good for amphibians. They're not natural. They're really not good for anything. All botanists know that plants respond differently to different times of fire. pteridium or bracken fern loves winter fire, and it proliferates under those conditions. And some other plants do better with winter fires, but very few amphibians do well with winter fires. There are a lot of negative effects. There's direct mortality of adults migrating to and from the pond, direct mortality of metamorphs and dispersing juveniles, direct mortality of eggs if the pond basin's dry when it burns, removes surface cover during migrations, removes the herbaceous layer, removes microhabitat for eggs, and then it excludes fire from the wetland basin. Usually these ponds have water in them in the winter, and so the basins don't burn, and they need to burn when the summer is hot and dry. There's a lot of indirect effects too, mostly woody shrub encroachment. We'll hear about all these things later when it comes to restoration efforts, but it can't hurt to emphasize them. Winter burning is bad for amphibians. This is a gopher frog I found killed by fire in late February. And landowners know, in many cases, they know that they're burning up these amphibians, and they either don't care or they don't care enough to change their burn regime to the summer, or they just can't get it through their head that a winter fire is not the same as a summer fire. Here's another gopher frog injured by a fire. This was even in late April. That may even be too early for a bird. It was had its tibia scorched pretty good there. This frog, we released it, but it probably died. It was found in a situation like this right under this log right after a hot fire went through. This is one of our beautiful ephemeral ponds that still exists in a pretty good condition. You can see there's no subdivisions around it. Brady Beck took this with a drone a while back. And this was a clay-based Carolina Bay in Robinson County that was once used by 26 amphibian species. Very few of those are present now. It's pretty much gone. There's a subdivision that just went in across the road from it. The Nature Conservancy is still trying to buy some of the adjacent land, but it's too little too late for a lot of these places. Some of them can be restored, but you can trash a place like this in a matter of hours, and it can take years and years to restore it, or an eternity to ever get it back the way it was. It's so much easier to protect these places than it is to try to restore them once they're gone. This is my tribute to Goose Pond Bay. This has been the attitude that people have had, prominent people in our society have had about wetlands historically, and many of them still have these same kinds of attitudes, and it's very difficult to get it into their heads that these places they're not only important, they're treasures, and they can't be replaced once they're destroyed. Some of them, it is possible to build isolated wetlands, but it's, as I've said, it's just so much easier to protect the ones that are here than try to create new ones. We'll hear some talks later about restoring them and trying to create new ones, and see how difficult that is compared to just saving what we've got. This was from an essay by a guy named Roy Woodward, who was working in California looking for ephemeral wetlands there. He was surveying fairy shrimp and rare aquatic insects and tiger salamanders and things like that. And he stopped an old cowboy on the ranch, and he said, I'm looking for vernal pools. And the old cowboy threw his hat back and got a faraway look in his eye and said, I don't think old Vern lives around here anymore. And he thought, well, that's a pretty fitting statement. Old Vern doesn't live around here anymore. Thanks, everybody. If you got questions, I'll answer them if I can.
Thank you, Jeff. If you have questions for Jeff, feel free to go ahead and drop those right into the chat. I'm going to let Jeff answer them there because in the interest of time, I am going to go ahead and keep us on schedule. We're just a hair ahead of schedule, which is a good thing. And we'll see if we get to the break, we might take, if we get there a little early, we might take a few questions at that point, but you're certainly welcome to throw questions you have in the chat. Okay, with that, I'm going to move on to Catherine Colada with the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, and let you talk to us a little bit about some of the plants that occur in these important wetlands as well.
All right, well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk about plants today. Let me get my screen pulled up. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, think I'm actually going to stop my video in the interest of internet speed. So my name is Catherine Colada. I'm the botanist and permit coordinator with the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program. So we are a state agency in the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, and we're the regulatory agency for rare plants in the state, meaning we maintain the list of rare species and also regulate activities concerning them. But in addition to our regulatory responsibilities, we're also land managers. We have 26 preserves scattered all across the state, including a number that protect wetland species. So today I'm just going to go over a few of the rare species that you're most likely to run into in working in isolated wetlands in eastern North Carolina, and sort of go through how to identify them and where they might be found. The first species I'd like to talk about is awned meadow beauty, or Rexia aristosa. This is getting towards the end of its flowering period now, so you may catch it if you're in the right place. This species is endemic to the southeastern coastal plain, and it especially favors clay-based Carolina bays. It is state listed as special concern vulnerable. So as far as identification goes, at first glance, it looks a lot like a lot of our other Rexias that are blooming this time of year with the nice showy four petals and showy anthers. But the really important thing to look out for this species is the long bristles around the edge of the capsule. So if you flip the flower over, or if you see it in fruit, those yellow kind of sharp bristles right around the edge of the capsule are there both in flower and fruit, and are a dead giveaway for the species. So it's really distinctive. The next species I'd like to talk about is the globe fruit seed box. This is Ludwigia Spherocarpa. This is another sort of wetland edge kind of species. It may grow with its feet in standing water, maybe kind of more on the edge of some wetlands. It's also wrapping up its flowering period right now. This is found actually pretty broadly throughout the eastern United States, but is relatively rare all across its range, just because its habitat is really limited to wetlands. It's endangered in North Carolina. So there are a number of common Ludwigia species that you'll run into in wetlands, but this is the only one that's going to have these really distinctive round capsules. So as opposed to the really squared off or kind of long and cylindrical or rectangular capsules that you may see in like a common seed box, these fruits are almost completely spherical. It also has really hairy stems that can help distinguish it from some other more common species. So next, another Ludwigia. This is Ludwigia Spherocarpa, or shrubby seed box. It also has really distinctive flowers and fruits. This species is pretty much always going to be growing in shallow pools, so less likely to see it sort of up on edges and more likely to be actually growing with its feet in water. Unlike most other Ludwigias, this species has its flowers in a terminal cluster. So as opposed to the more common ones that have their flowers and fruits in the axils of the leaves kind of spread up and down the stem, with this species, it's all clustered right up top. Without the flowers and fruits, it's really easy to overlook because it's just maybe like, knee or waist high, not super distinctive leaves. But if you're able to catch it in flower or in fruit, that dense cluster will be a dead giveaway. So this species is a southeast coastal plain endemic. So it's found, from around here down into Florida. And it's threatened in North Carolina. Okay. Next species I'd like to highlight is the threadleaf sundew, Dracera Philipormus. So this is probably the most distinctive and easy to recognize of the plants I'm talking about today. It's also kind of wrapping up its flowering period now, although this species, you really don't need flowers to get a good ID on it. This is the only species of sundew in North Carolina that has these long filiform leaves. All of our others will have a little rosette and kind of rounded off leaf blades. So those long hair-like leaves are super distinctive. And of course they have those sticky glands on them that will catch insects. When the species is in flower, it's also pretty easy to catch your eye because it has relatively large flowers for the genus. The flowers are something like 1/2 inch across. So from a distance, it's possible to spot them. This species is also throughout Eastern North America and is special concern vulnerable in North Carolina. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few Sagittarias. As I was sort of looking at the list of potential species to talk about today, it jumped out at me that North Carolina has a lot of listed Sagittarias, and a good chunk of them are found only in wetlands in the eastern part of the state. So Sagittaria weatherbyana, or Weatherby's arrowhead, is this is the first species I'm talking about today that's actually not in flower right now. So you'll have to wait for the spring to try and catch this one. It flowers from April to June. So we have a lot of diversity of Sagittaria in the state, but all of the rare Sagittarias are in the group within this genus that actually don't have arrowhead shaped leaves. So Sagittaria weatherbyana has elliptical leaves, and they're pretty broad, up to about 2 or 3 centimeters wide. This plant spreads rhizomatously and is found in shallow water. So it may, with some seasonal drying, be up on a little bit of drier land, but it's pretty much going to be restricted to nice damp areas of still water. So the species is throughout the southeastern coastal plain. And the other thing to look out for identification for this species is that the flowering stems are relatively long. So the stem between like the main axis of the inflorescence and each individual flower is relatively long compared to other more common species in the genus. Our next Sagittaria is Sagittaria Philipormus. This species is actually less found in the sort of isolated wetlands that we're focused on today, and is more commonly found in blackwater streams. But I did want to highlight it because it's historic in the state, possibly even extirpated. And so it'd be a great one to keep an eye out for if we could, re-find this species in the state. That's happened a few times recently, that folks have rediscovered populations of plants that we thought were completely lost from the state. So it's not impossible. So this species has really distinctive, it has a distinctive combination of leaves and flowers. So the flowers look a lot like any other Sagittaria with the 3 white petals, but the submersed leaves are really distinctive in that they're very long and very narrow. This species is found throughout the Atlantic coastal plain, so it gets as far north as Maine. And it's sometimes has, in addition to the really long, narrow submersed leaves, some broader immersed leaves that you can see in the center photo. It seems like it doesn't always have those broader leaves, but the long and narrow leaves are pretty constant. Right, and one more Sagittaria. So this is the quillwort arrowhead, or Sagittaria isoidiformis. So if anyone has worked with or run across quillworts before, you can kind of see from the center photo why this species is named as it is. When this species is not in flower, it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to tell that it's a Sagittaria. It looks much more like maybe some small aquatic rush or the quillwort that it's named for. But it flowers from June to September, and when those flowers are present, it's very clear that it's a Sagittaria. So this species is found in the southeastern coastal plain, and in North Carolina, it's state listed as threatened. So unlike the Sagittaria Philipormus that we looked at before, the round, narrow leaves on this species grow immersed from mud. So they'll be, sticking up, more or less looking like a quillwort. Really, I've never seen this species in person, but it seems like it's really interesting. Okay. I do have to throw in one graminoid. I know graminoids can get kind of intimidating maybe, but they don't have to be. So robin spike rush, or Eliochorus robinsii. This is a species that's distributed throughout Eastern North America. It even gets as far west as like wetlands in the Midwest, but it's relatively rare all throughout its range just because it's restricted to these really wetland habitats. So this species will be in flower and fruit in midsummer from June through September. And in North Carolina, it's state listed as special concern vulnerable. So the reason I wanted to include this one, even though it is a graminoid, is that it's very distinctive as spike rushes go. So there's only a small number of species in our state where the stem is more or less the same width as the flowering spike. So in that photo with the close-up, you can see that there's really not much of a difference between where the stem ends and the spike starts. And in this species, the spike is very pointed at the tip and the stem is 3-angled. So the combination of those 3 features make this a relatively easy one to catch in the field. In that kind of more habitat photo on the left, it's growing out more in the middle of that pond, and that's its preferred habitat. It's going to be in relatively deep water. The last species I'd like to highlight today is Utricularia floridana. This is another state historic species. It hasn't been seen in the state in quite a while, so it's another one that would be just great if we could maybe rediscover it. This bladderwort has leaves both with and without the characteristic bladder traps. And it grows in relatively deep water. It won't grow in water that's less than about maybe 2 or 3 feet deep. And that is one thing that helps separate it from the more common Utricularia striata that it looks pretty similar to in North Carolina. Another way to separate those two is that the flowering stalk in this Florida yellow bladderwort is really kind of curvy and twisty, as opposed to a very straight stalk in the Utricularia striata. And this is another species that's restricted to the southeastern coastal plain. It's actually most widespread in Florida. I do have to put a plug in here to submit your observations to the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program database. If you do run across any of these species or any other, they make it really easy to submit data. You can just go to their website and they have an online survey form where they'll ask you, every single thing that you could possibly know about a population that you've observed. But don't let that scare you away, because you don't have to fill out every single thing. Having some data is definitely better than having none. And I always have to put out this plug anytime I give a talk to get all of your rare species observations submitted to the Natural Heritage Program, because so many groups depend on their data to do their work in the state. PCP is definitely one of them. As I mentioned, we are the agency in the state that maintains the list of protected plant species. And our starting point for that is observations submitted to the Natural Heritage Program. Their data can also be used for prioritizing conservation sites based on how many rare species are found there, and for assessing the health of species throughout the state. And then I just want to close out with a couple of resources that I think y'all might appreciate. The first is this new book that came out about a year ago. That's the Guide to Common Wetland Plants of North Carolina. It's a really awesome visual guide, walks you through a lot of the common things that you're likely to run into separated by mountain, Piedmont, and coastal plain regions. I believe they're still offering print versions of the book, but you can also download a free PDF at ncwetlands.org. So I highly recommend that if you're wanting to learn more about wetland plants. And then also the Vascular Plants of North Carolina website, which many of you may already be familiar with. It's part of the North Carolina Biodiversity Project, and it's a great starting point to get information like range, habitat description, and ID tips for all of our vascular flora. So that's all that I have. So I think we have a little time for questions.
All right, thank you, Catherine. Yes, we do have some time for questions. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with one question that's in the chat. If you have a question for either Jeff Marcus, Jeff Bean, or Catherine, you can raise your hand. You do that by looking at the screen. You've got reactions at the bottom. You can click raise hand, and then I will call on you if you have a question. Otherwise, I will just read them from the chat. So first question is from Debbie here for you, Catherine. It says, does NC Natural Heritage Program or NCFS work with landowners who have Atlantic white cedar? And I don't know if you know the answer to that, since neither of those situations are you exactly, but do you happen to know?
Looks like Julian's on top of it, but I don't.
I just put in the chat for Debbie, but yes, I don't know if the Natural Heritage Program does site visits, but if you contact the county ranger office using that link to the contacts page, they should be able to send someone out to do a site visit and work with whatever landowner, whether that's you or someone you know.
And I noticed that Mike Shafley's unmiked. Were you going to say something about natural
Yeah,
heritage, Mike?
Yeah, I can speak for the Natural Heritage Program. I do work for the Natural Heritage Program, and we are interested in visiting lands. Anybody that has rare species or natural communities that seem to be in pretty good natural condition, and that would certainly include white cedar communities. Not every place that there's a tree, but where there's a community dominated by it. Honestly, our capacity is a lot less than our desire. So if somebody contacts us, it may take a while. We will have to fit it in with the priorities we have, but we definitely are interested and would love to hear from people.
All right, great. Any other questions that anybody has? Not seeing any particular, I don't see any hands raised. Anybody have a burning question out there? Or a
Jeff, while I can jump in for a second. Yeah, while folks are thinking of some questions they may have, I just want to take a moment to appreciate the comment by Mr. Sickle previously acknowledging the First Nations use of fire, and take a moment to acknowledge that this region that we're talking about, the Bladen Lakes region, is interestingly also sort of the crossroads or the meeting point of three different tribes in eastern North Carolina: the Kohari, Lumbee, and the Waccamaw Siouan. And while none of these tribes have a large tribal lands that are in this area, there are a lot of landowners in this region from these tribes, and just acknowledging that they're important stakeholder to be working with and engaging as we talk about land management and wetland restoration.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for noting that, Jeff. Perfect. All right, well, I'm not seeing any particular questions, so we'll go ahead and take our break. It's 2:08. Let's plan to come back at 2:20. So that will give you about a 12-minute break. So 2:20, I will leave the webinar open, so you can feel free to step away for just a moment. When we return, Mike Shafley will share a little bit more about natural communities of these types of systems. So we will do that momentarily, and I'm going to pause the recording here. And like I say, we'll begin again at 2:20. Okay, you can go ahead and share your screen, but we won't get started for a few more minutes. All right, welcome everybody. Hopefully everybody was able to make it back to us. I'm pleased that next up we have Mike Shafley to talk with us about natural communities, and should be wonderful from North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. So take it away, Mike.
Okay, you can hear me and I'm in the full screen mode.
Sure. Yep, we can hear you and see you.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to talk about isolated wetlands from the natural community perspective, and particularly from the perspective of the classification we use in the Natural Heritage Program, which we all know informally as the fourth approximation. I'll start out by saying, so in the fourth approximation, our highest level of the classification is called themes. There are 30 some of them. And even at that very broad level, there are a number that contain isolated wetlands in the coastal plain. And that includes things like low elevation seeps. There's a nice one in Bladen Lakes State Forest, those big peatland pocosins, and the non-riverine swamp forest that may or may not have an outlet stream that you can find, at least anymore. The pine savannas that people often don't really think of as even being wetlands, but they are. And even the little wetlands embedded in the dunes on the barrier islands. But I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about the theme we call coastal plain depressional communities, that fits most closely to what's been being talked about today. So these are communities of small basins that hold standing water, surface water, at least sometime during ordinary years, what we think of as ordinary years. They are almost always surrounded by upland communities rather than other wetlands. They very seldom have any surface water connection. So they are sort of the quintessential isolated wetlands. Now, within our classification, I made a list of all the different communities that occur in the Bladen Lakes area. There's two screens of this, and I'm going to sort of flip back and forth slowly so you can see them all as I'm talking. There's 2 or 3 others that occur elsewhere in the coastal plain but are not known in the Bladen Lakes area. So I will say that if somebody asked me where's the great places for coastal plain depression communities in North Carolina, I'd say Croatan National Forest or Boiling Spring Lakes or Carolina Beach State Park. I would not say Bladen Lakes area. And yet all but just a very small handful of the community types that we have in the state are at least known in the Bladen Lakes area. But it's sort of the same picture that you heard in some of the earlier talks, that they're there, but there are very few good examples known that are left. None of these communities do we have more than 3 examples recorded that are in good shape, and sometimes the good shape is only marginally good. They're there and hanging on, but not the best. I'm sure there are more out there, and I would love to hear from folks about them. So anyway, there's quite a few of these different communities. I'm gonna sort of try to put them in some order, and then I'll take you on a quick pictorial tour of a lot of them. So they can be sort of grouped into categories that I'll call basin filling communities and zonal communities. The zonal communities are ones where you tend to have 2 or 3 within a single depression. The basin filling ones tend to, pretty much make up all or most of the patch. The basin filling ones are all woody dominated. They tend to have substantial tree canopies. The zonal communities vary from being completely treeless to having moderate amounts of woody presence, or a few have dense woody growth. The zonal communities, you can generally tell why you have the ones where they are, in the sense that when you see several together, you can tell that some are in distinctly wetter or deeper places than others. But at the same time, it's worth noting that you never seem to have all the possible zonal communities present in a basin. There's always some that seem to be missing in the gradient, or at least present only in very small areas that you can't really write home about. Because they often have a lot of herbaceous vegetation, their aspect can vary quite a lot in response to different conditions from year to year, depending on the water levels. Nevertheless, the zones are relatively fixed because of characteristics of the soil that have to do with the typical water levels over the long term. And the wetter ones tend to have a muck layer that develops on the soil surface that you don't have in the shallower ones. And so even when the water levels vary, you can sort of tell where the zones are. The zones are driven, and the basin filling communities as well, we think, are driven by things such as the shape of the basin, how steep it is, and whether you have a large flat area at one level so that you can have a lot of a community, or whether you have slopes where you have varying water depths. Other things that seem to matter sometimes, at least, are how much slope you have above the normal high water level, which can affect how readily fire can penetrate them. Even the relief of the surrounding landscape and the soil texture, both of which affect the water table and how much it goes up and down. But a lot of the explanation for the patterns is the ever popular none of above, where we don't really know exactly what's causing the differences. I noted that in the zonal communities, the amount of woody vegetation can vary. Sometimes it's clear you've got more woody vegetation than you used to, or at least it looks like woody vegetation has invaded, and that's presumably because of the absence of fire. But other times they're pretty woody, and that looks completely natural, and it just seems to be what it is. Not clear why. It'll be sometimes one thing and sometimes another. And sometimes in places where you have more of these coastal plain depression communities together, you'll get them both in the same complex pretty close together, where presumably they do in fact have the same land use history. It is a place where there's room to suspect some sort of long-term natural succession may matter, or maybe even cyclic succession, and a reason to think such a thing might occur. This is an illustration from the paper by David Staley and his colleagues. We mostly think of it as the paper that made the Black River famous for first publishing the very great ages of the cypress trees there. But he was a dendrochronologist, and his genius as a dendrochronologist is that he thought maybe you could actually get a long-term signal of dry and wet periods from these trees that grow with their feet in the water. And amazingly enough, he was right. So the black and white bars on the bottom are showing periods where the water levels were either higher or lower than the time around them. And you can see that there was a lot of fluctuation of periods that actually lasted a pretty long time. And a lot of these unusually dry or wet periods, the average was 34 years. So you can think about what might change over in 3 decades or 4 decades, either in terms of a lot of fires penetrating a place back when we had lots of fires, or conversely, trees getting established and then hanging on through drier periods. So there's a lot of chance for natural fluctuation there, but though we really don't know much about it. We really don't know much about the short term either. We have pretty much no record that I'm aware of where somebody actually has documented one sort of version of vegetation turning into another in real time. So anyway, I'm going to take you with those introductory remarks. I'm going to take you on a tour of some of these things, starting with basin filling communities. Again, these tend to be forested, or at least substantially treed. One kind of ephemeral wetlands or isolated wetlands that the Bladen Lakes area is lacking are cypress savannas. That there are none of the classic Antioch Bay sort of cypress savannas that I know of in the Bladen Lakes area, and there's only one rather poor example of the acidic subtype. But they do have the coastal plain depression swamps, which are communities dominated by either cypress or swamp black gum, and they have small depression pocosins, which are communities dominated by pines, usually pond pine, and the shrub layers determine the subtypes of these things. And the ones I mentioned at the bottom are ones that don't occur in the Bladen Lakes area. So this is a typical look of a coastal plain depression swamp. They're very shrubby, as well as having trees. In the typic subtype, they're shrubs other than mostly what you think of as pocosin shrubs. In the pocosin subtype, they are things like gallberry and fetterbush, evergreen things that you think of as being typical of pocosins. If they get dry enough, fires can go through there, burn up the shrub layer, maybe kill the trees, although it's interesting how often the trees survive the fires. Small depressing pocosins, again, pines, dense shrubs. This is a very benign one because it's very small, so you're seeing all the way through it, but they can be a bit bigger than this. And again, usually the evergreen shrubs, things like tie. So structurally, they look a lot like the big peatland pocosins, but there's enough differences that we don't treat them as just small occurrences of that. And then there's this really odd, pretty rare thing that we call the blueberry subtype, where the the dense shrub layer is high bush blueberries, and seems to be a little wetter, more standing water, maybe for longer. And because they're deciduous and not as dense in their shrub canopy, you get a little more herb cover on the ground. If we go to the zonal communities, again, because you so often see 2 or 3 together, you can put them into a pretty clear pecking order as far as their wetness. And that's a good way of thinking about them. So if we start at the wet end, we have the open lily pond subtype. This water can be, pretty deep, deep enough that you have no emergent plants sticking out of most of it. It may be covered with water lilies or other floating leaf plants, or it may be just open water, bare water. They're fairly often treeless, but they're also fairly often have a few trees in the interior and shrubs leaning out from the edges, or shrubs established on the bases of the trees in the interior. So especially if they're not real large, you can get a substantial amount of woody cover in them still, even though the water is deep enough that only in those local spots do you have any emergent vegetation. And note that in a situation like the one pictured here, those shrubs didn't come in because lack of fire. Fire would not penetrate across this very wet basin. Going slightly up the moisture gradient, we have the typic marsh subtype. You can see some inclusions of open lily pond there, but they're a small minority. That's something you get very often in these basins. The typic marsh subtype, you still have enough water that standing well enough into the growing season but it's shallow enough that you get emergent grass or sedge vegetation. The classic plant of these things is maiden cane, and it can fill a whole basin, or it can be a zone along one side or in a ring around a deeper center. There's a rare version of this that's dominated by the tall cut grasses instead. And this is a site we all love that's known as the Bog Hole or 17 Frog Pond, or I met it first under the name of Grassy Pond when I first came to North Carolina. It's in the Sandhills game land, and it's famous as an amphibian breeding site and also a site for rare plants. It's a very rare community. There's only a handful of these in the state. This is another one you may know, Tunstall Bay, a very different aspect because it's taken when the water's high instead of low. But those two are about half of what we have in the state of that subtype. Going a little drier, we have a community we call Small Depression Drawdown Meadow. Superficially in a picture, it looks very similar. The herbaceous growth is generally dense. But the plants are a bit smaller. Botanists love these places. Most of the rare plants that Catherine was talking about, this is their habitat, is this community. And they often have showy flowers when the water's down and the plants are active. They're some of the nicest vegetation to just go look at. So that's a picture of what they often look like when the water's down. When the water is up, they can look kind of different. And again, you can see one little tree in there. They often have no trees in them. Fire can penetrate them very easily, but sometimes they have scattered trees, and this is also the habitat on the edge of it for the pond spice, one of our rare plants. There is a rare kind of odd version of Small Depression Drawdown Meadows as well, which is a super acidic one that tends to be covered with sphagnum and has a narrower set of plant species that are tolerant of those extremely acidic conditions. Not as many of them. Again, not really that obvious why you get this subtype instead of the typic subtype, but I've never heard of one where anybody could definitively say one turned into the other. So I don't think it is, in fact, a question of land use history or something like that. And then as you get drier, we have the things we call vernal pools that are, again, where the water doesn't last very long at all and tend to be very grassy. And the grasses in these guys are things like switchgrass and broom sedges that are shared with the longleaf pine communities around them, but they're too small, they're too dry, but too wet for longleaf pine or wiregrass. And so they often will stand out as these distinctive open areas that are a little bit lower, even if you don't see the water, but sometimes you're not sure if you hit them in the dry season fires can burn through them very easily since they're dry pretty much all the growing season. So let me just end with a few comments for land managers, since this is about management and restoration. And this is a combination, I guess, of warnings and statements of sympathy. If you're in charge of managing a place with coastal plain depression communities, they are complicated. There's all those different community types, and as I've noted, there even within them, there's quite a lot of variability, and so it's kind of hard to tell what a given place wants to be. And sometimes take some scratching your head and asking for help sometimes. And in particular, since this is going to be a major issue in talking about restoration and assessing the condition of these things, some of these ponds have definitely suffered woody invasion because of fire suppression, while others seem to be naturally woody. And so one of the crucial things you need to do when you're thinking about restoration is to tell which situation you have. One warning I would give is that these ponds are not blank canvases to just do whatever you want with. If you're a natural area manager, they are things that have a natural state, and most of them are not going to be the bog hole. That's a rare community type. And if you're thinking about it from the point of view of some of these rare species that we've been talking about, and we do really want to improve the prospects for, not every given pond is obligated or even capable of growing the vegetation that we think they need. So we need to choose the right ponds to focus on for those. And if you're doing restoration or assessing a restoration attempt and whether it was successful, you need to remember that restoration involves the species composition, not just the vegetation structure. If you say, oh, we got a lot of herbs by what we did on this pond, but those herbs are Scarpus cyperinus or dog fennel or something like that, well, that wasn't really success. You just created a weed patch. If you got warty panic grass, well, that's a species that comes up in good places and bad places. So you really don't know yet whether your restoration succeeded in terms of the plant species composition. So you need to sort of keep that in mind, or view those things with real attention to detail. There are some rules of thumb that I think can work pretty well if you're thinking about what you should do with your depressional wetlands. There are some species that we know don't have much of any of a role in natural communities, and so if you've got them, that's probably a sign that things are seriously out of whack, and you can generally not go wrong removing them. The sweet gum and loblolly pine are the big ones there. The other sort of trees that you might get showing up in these things are less certain because they do often occur in natural communities, and that includes cypress and swamp black gum. And interestingly, it includes red maple, which in just about every other community is really a fire suppression invader. But in these depression wetlands, the ones that are configured so that fire doesn't penetrate readily, you can have these old red maples that look like they really belong there. One thing that is a good hint is the age patterns of the trees. If you have a few old trees and a lot of young ones, then probably the old ones belong. The young ones, you can really suspect maybe they don't. If you have no old ones, it's actually harder because somebody may have cut out the old ones, and then you have less clear sense of what's going on. Old aerial photos can be helpful from this, but if and only if they depict a situation that is less altered than what you have now. Aerial photos only go back to the 1930s, and the 1930s were not necessarily the paragon of unaltered landscapes or vegetation in all places. So if you have an aerial photo, but it shows that somebody just walked off with all the trees in the upland, and you don't see any trees in that photo, then the fact that you don't see any trees in the basin may just tell you that people cut them at the same time. Even where there's more recent cutting, you can often see the stumps to demonstrate that. On the other hand, if you see that the uplands are cut over, but you do see trees in the basins, that's maybe a stronger hint that trees have been a long-term part of that basin. So it really, you got to think hard about things even there. But one thing we can definitely say is you can hardly go wrong with fire. Anytime you can get a fire through one of these basins, it's a good thing to do, and whatever it does, probably that's the right thing. You can't say that so much about other things you might do when you get into cutting, and especially when you get into using herbicide and even more heavy equipment. You can alter conditions very heavily, very quickly in ways that you may regret, or at least should regret, if you don't understand your system very, very well. There are a few other general principles. Always good to use the carpet cleaner principle. If you aren't sure, try it in a small hidden area first before you use it over the whole thing. And if all else fails, fall back to the Hippocratic principle of do no harm. So that's what I got for you. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mike. Good stuff. Good food for thought. One person did ask about the if there was a document that lists these communities and characteristics of each. So into the chat, I posted the link for the 4th approximation of the Guide to Classification of Natural Communities. So you can go and look at that. It is quite the detailed tome, and Mike can answer all kinds of questions about that I can't even think about.
Yeah, well, let me just say very quickly, there's 2 versions of the 4th approximation now. Both of them are available in the Natural Heritage Program website at this moment. There is the guide that has quick descriptions of how you tell them apart. There is a much more detailed book that's underway. There's a complete draft now ready, and it's offered for use and review on our website as well. The community types are grouped by, we're calling them fascicles, but they're basically all the material about the communities in a given theme. So you will find a fascicle for coastal plain depression communities. It's in final draft form. I'm going to be finalizing it this winter, and then it will be officially published, as you know, probably with a 2023 publication date. But all the details now is there now, so you can read about any and all of these communities that I talked about by getting the fascicle if you want to, and by all means write to me and you know, share your sites, or as I said earlier, I would love to visit them to the extent that I can make it work with my schedule.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Mike. If you can stop sharing your screen, and we'll pass the baton on to Jeff Humphreys. And Jeff,
While Jeff shares his screen too, we have a question from Sandra about if any sightings of endangered plant and animals could be found and used by searching citizen science observations on iNaturalist. I don't know if
yeah,
Mike, you want to take that, or maybe Catherine? Jeff, sorry.
that's good. Go, Mike.
I can say something for starters anyway, that I know, not me, but our botanists in the Natural Heritage Program do search iNaturalist for observations of rare plant species and try to vet them and get the data from them into our database. Most of our, I don't know how much our zoologists are doing that, but I think the Wildlife Commission folks are. Jeff can talk about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you can use iNaturalist for some things. One complication is that iNaturalist, in a good way, obfuscates or makes difficult to see the exact location of some things that are in it. And you cannot get access to that data unless you contact each individual observer. So I won't go into it a whole lot more now, because I don't want us to get off topic or off time. So I'm just going to roll right on in to Jeff Humphreys. And there's a lot more that we could say about that, but community science records are super helpful. So I would definitely encourage people to still submit them. They can just be a little bit complicated to get access to.
Hi, Jeff. I'm trying to share my screen.
No problemo.
All right. Yeah. I don't know why my mouse is being crazy. There we go. Can you see that?
Yep, got you.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Humphreys. I'm a biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, focused mainly on herpetology in the eastern part of the state. And I wrote my title as a success story, but after hearing Mike's talk just now, I don't know, he might disagree. we do a lot of work in the Sandhills game land with isolated wetlands and restoring sites that, in my view, are not natural ecosystems. They have been overtaken by succession because of lack of fire, because of other just past land use. I think land use is a huge, huge thing that we need to consider. So I'm going to talk about one project, well, just things in general. So this is 17 Frog Pond or Bog Hole, which Mike mentioned. And this is, like he said, it's one of the best examples of a depressional wetland in the state. It's been managed with fire for, I guess, forever, basically. Brady Beck took this photo with a drone. It's pretty cool. Why focus on amphibians? Like Mike said, your favorite species. These are my favorite species. North Carolina has a really high diversity of amphibians. The mountains were the highest diversity of salamanders in the world. And our coastal plain has one of the highest diversities of frogs of anywhere in the United States. And a lot of these, I should say, are very rare because of things that have changed on the landscape. So here's the Sandhills Eco Region. You can see it's in the red. It's a very narrow band through the Carolinas and Georgia. But it's a very narrow band of really unique habitat, but it contains a lot of really rare species, really interesting species. So I guess I wanted to say just natural fire and seasonal rains are critical for maintaining herbaceous vegetation in these sites. This is Bog Hole or 17 Frog Pond, Grassy Pond, whatever you want to call it. And you can see it goes from this during dry years or during the summer, and it can be deep enough that you can go on a voyage in a canoe when it fills up with water, usually in the fall, and water usually remains until the next summer. I think Jeff Bean said something about our canoe trip out there. I forget what it was, but so here's 17 Frog Pond in the Sandhills game land, and if you look at it, it goes completely dry, pretty much, you know, at least every couple of years. It'll go completely dry, but then it'll fill up with water, you know, 6 to maybe over 6 feet deep. It maintains this interesting ecotone of vegetation, very rare plants, plants specific to these locations, and I think a lot of managers, if you looked at this in the past, you would just see like kind of like a field. And actually, somebody tried to put a food plot in this thing in the 90s. Fortunately, it didn't. Somebody stopped them, I guess. But if you delve into what's out there, which Jeff Bean and Alvin Roswell and people like that, and me coming along, and other biologists, you'll realize pretty quickly that there's a really huge diversity of species. That can, I'm not saying that these species specifically use this pond, but all these species can be found using isolated wetlands. And I have had pine barrens tree frogs using isolated wetlands, which is pretty interesting. So what keeps these ecosystems open and grassy, herbaceous covered? To me, it's between hydro period and fire. So in places like the Croatan National Forest, these are those lily pond types that Mike was talking about. I think long hydro period keeps those from establishing trees along with fire. These probably rarely dry up, some of these deeper ones. Others do dry all the time, and fire will come through and take out, you know, any establishing woody vegetation. Then also, I think periodic fires is way underestimated in how these wetlands remain open and grassy. And I think it's not just that they need fire during a specific time, a time when the ponds are dry. Fire can take out a lot of trees when it's hot, low humidity, dry, windy, etc. Times when a lot of people don't like to burn because it can be dangerous for, you know, motorists and stuff like that. But it's critical, I think, to maintain habitats. I think it's usually a combination of both hydro period and fire. So our buddy Smokey the Bear, my homeboy, I think he was a major problem back in the, like Mike said, in the 30s. and even up until now. You can see what's happening in California, et cetera. Wetlands were intentionally cut off by fire lines in a lot of areas, keeping fires out of lowland wet areas. They were thought of as refugia for things like quail. There's actually papers on, quail need to get red bay berries and stuff like that, and they need a place to hang out and not get burned up, etc., which is all just not true. And then smoke is also become an issue as places have become built up with suburbs and stuff like that. But when you remove fire from the system, you get Jeff Hall here standing in what I would contend is not a natural community. This is on Croatan National Forest. This is a site. There's plenty of these ponds around. This is a sort of the central part of Croatan, and a lot of these ponds had gopher frogs 40 years ago, if not more recent, but they turned into this because, I would argue, because of lack of fire at the right time of year. Fire may be in these systems, but if you're burning in the winter when water is standing like this, it's not going to go through. I'm not saying fire went through every wetland all the time, but I think when wetlands did go through a drought period and the right fire hit at the right time, it would sort of reset these ponds. Mike Shafley, I know you're rolling around right now, wanting to yell at me. So what is the effects of tree encroachment on amphibians using isolated wetlands? These are just to get to the data of it. Increased evapotranspiration, so the trees basically act like straws and suck water out of the wetlands. So the hydro period is too short to allow for a lot of amphibians to go through metamorphosis. It can lower water temperature because the canopy cover results in slower larval development, lower oxygen availability, and reduced algal communities, which are for what these animals need to eat. A lot of tadpoles. Leaf litter and duff accumulation can lower pH levels to the point that larval amphibians cannot survive. We've seen this in a lot of ponds, especially around Matsu and Sunny Point. So why is grassy, besides just having rare plants and interesting plants, why is this grassy herbaceous substrate essential to amphibian breeding? Well, for a lot of species like the gopher frog on the left and the tiger salamander on the right, you can see that they need to attach their eggs to some sort of stem that's not a tree. They need grassy, either broom sedge sort of stuff or maiden cane or something like that. And well, otherwise these animals just will not breed in these sites if there's no herbaceous vegetation. So I think Jeff Bean showed this graph earlier. I don't know if we were thinking exactly the same, but I can't see my top here, sorry. So when did these places historically burn? If you look at lightning fires, this is from Reed and Oss's paper in 2018, lightning fires were, basically in the midsummer, like Jeff said earlier, usually when the ponds are dry, usually June, July, or August, and relatively, hardly any fires would likely have happened naturally. Native Americans probably lit a lot of fires during the winter, but lightning fires were primarily during the summer months. Jeff also had this graph, so this one just shows, he already explained this, but this is the water level right here. So when the water level gets really low in these ponds, this is from a paper, I think this is Florida, but it applies to here too. When the water level gets really low, that's when lightning season starts. So that's what would have kept these ponds open. Right now, a lot of managers burn in January, February, March during the winter, and I get that for trying to restore a longleaf pine forest. But I think at some point you got to go to a maintenance stage where you start trying to burn only when those ponds are dry to maintain open grassy wetlands for my favorite species. So I'm just going to go through one example of one pond that I think is a success story, great success story for a lot of species and plants and animals both. And this is in the Sandhills region. This is Block T. I'm not a very creative name giver to ponds. So this is what we call Block T pond. It's on the southern end of the Sandhills game land across from the Rockingham Speedway, if you all know where that is. And this is Bill Parsons when he was the manager at Sandhills Game Land, looking at what I call a wetland. And looking at that, would you call that a wetland? I don't know. There's a lot of just catbrier and a lot of hardwoods. There's loblolly in there. But if you look at this site, this is from another angle. Well, Bill was standing like over here, I think, looking back that way. You can see there's still a little bit of open grassy area right in the middle of it. If you look at these trees, here's the water line, right? You know, so this gets really deep. It historically got really deep. But what I noticed when I first started my job in 2007 is this pond would fill up with water, and some things would try to use it, spring peepers, etc. But it would, the trees would basically suck the water out so quickly that nothing could survive to metamorphosis, amphibian wise. And you know, basically you're looking at what I think is just a remnant. That's what I thought when I first looked at it. It's just this thing used to be a lot different. I think it used to look like 17 Frog Pond. So I started going through old aerial photos, and this is what I found. These were in boxes at the Sandhills Game Land Depot. So I found aerial photos from 1950. This is the pond. What it looked like in 1950. You can see the uplands were very, very open. The wetland basin had some vegetation around it, but not a whole lot. It's a very, very open system. By 1968, you can see that it's kind of the same, but you can start seeing trees are actually filling in these basins, and also trees have massively filled in this pond. 1988, I don't think there's much to say there. It's just the forest has become completely forested with longleaf and other species, and you can see that the wetland is almost unrecognizable. It's right there. If you can, well, you can see where it is. 2006, the uplands had begun to be thinned to maintain a open longleaf wiregrass ecosystem, but the wetland just, I think what I would say is it's too far gone. Basically, fire was getting in here, but I think those trees had gotten so big since the 50s and 60s that fire just wasn't going to take them out. So we decided to do what Mike suggested not to do, but sorry, Mike. This is that pond. After we took, basically we did we decided to go heavy-handed on it and not go out and just cut trees and turn it into a broken down tree swamp. So we decided to go heavy-handed. This has been done in Mississippi and Florida and a lot of other places. Being done right now in Georgia a lot. We used heavy equipment. We had loggers go in when it was bone dry, so we didn't have any rutting issues. Cut all the trees out of it, every single one. It left the stumps, but what you had was we burned it. This was clear cut in 2011, and then the uplands were just thinned, so it's nice longleaf savanna. It was burned later that summer in 2011, just to see if we could get a lot of this duff layer off. There's a really thick duff layer, like a foot deep or so, just from decades and decades of needle fall and leaf fall, etc. That fire really didn't do a whole lot. It just kind of scorched the area, making it easier for our equipment to go in. But then we used, like I said, we went heavy-handed, but this is a root rake. We went in and just got that duff off, and on the left you can see the technical horizons that we removed. So we're trying to just get rid of that upper duff level and peat, etc., and trying to be as careful as possible. I know it looks crazy, but trying to be as careful as possible to remove the duff, remove all these branches and things that are down, and get it back to, so here's, you can see here's this area has been root raked and all that duff is gone, but we haven't really disturbed the soil that much. This is an area that has yet to be root raked. It did get root raked eventually, but you can see all the duff and other stuff lying there. Just not letting that seed bank even be near the surface. We were hoping there was still a good seed bank at the bottom of this once you remove the duff and the trees. So after we moved the duff, we bunched up all the remaining trees that were there and put them, basically just let them over top of stumps and hoping that they would just burn off eventually over time. So this is what it looked like. It's not pretty, I understand that. We burned these piles with hand torches for a while, and then this is one of the days we were just out there just kind of torching these. You can see some sweet gums already starting to come up in the middle. We were just going in by hand and just torching these little areas. So what happened? So September 2011, this is 2012. The clear cut was completed earlier in the year, or earlier the previous year. This is the first year after it started holding water again. You can see you get this lovely dog fennel and stuff like that. I'm just joking, it's not lovely, but it just looks like sort of a construction site, right? It's not, it's kind of a bunch of trash species. If you forward to 2013, that those really common species start sort of disappearing. You start getting native grasses, sedges, etc. coming in. And then I'm just going to fast forward in the sake of time, see what my time is, to January of 2021. This is what it looks like when it's full of water. I guess in the middle, it would get about 6 feet deep, whereas before it would sometimes get pretty deep, but it would dry up very quickly. So this is typically what it looks like every winter during high water years. This was March 2021. This is as high as it ever got. You'd have to take a boat out there to survey for anything, which is what we do. Mike Martin, my technician, and I would go out and survey for species. We also put up frog loggers. These are automated recording devices around this pond to determine which species are calling. And then we go out and we search for egg masses and things like that for further identification of species. And here is a workshop we did several years ago. It's similar to this workshop, well, same as this workshop, except in the Sandhills. And interestingly enough, field biologists flock to open grassy wetlands, not ones that are closed canopy, just like our rare species do. But this is what it looks like, and this was, I forget which year this is, Jeff could tell me, but this is what it looks like when it's dry, and you can see just a lot of nice herbaceous vegetation out there. It's basically treeless. There's a few sweet gum and maple and stuff like that trying to come in, but once we burn, it usually takes that out. So here's what we found pre-restoration. To my knowledge, this is what I know of. There were 3 amphibian species that I ever heard out there or saw: spring peeper, eastern Birkenstripe newt, and southern crooked frog. But I never knew of them breeding. I'm sure they did breed sometimes, but still, there are only 3 very, very common species out there. Post-restoration, we counted 16 amphibian species breeding. This is through years of looking for animals, listening to frog calls on automated recorders. A lot of interesting species showed up. Like, there were no tiger salamanders there before, and now there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of egg masses just about every year when it fills up. I had Harlan Anderson, the Pine Barrens tree frog using this site, which is really strange. Just femoralis, looking at my list over here, a lot of really interesting species. Tons and tons of barking tree frogs found this site. And it kind of makes you wonder, where were all these species? Where have they been for all these years when that site was pretty much unusable? Also, cottonmouths love this place, and duck hunters love it because wood ducks sometimes cover the place. We are currently reintroducing, I'm going to say reintroducing, I'll say we're putting gopher frogs there and ornate chorus frogs as well to try to establish populations of these extremely rare species. The gopher frogs only occur at one site on the Sandhills game land. Well, a couple other small ponds, but one main pond that they use. We're trying to establish a metapopulation of gopher frogs. Ornate chorus frogs have been extirpated from the game lands. We are trying to put them back there, get them back into at least some of the ponds on the game lands. These are coming from Fort Bragg. And then I talked to Bruce Story, who, we had a lot of talks when we were first starting to think about what to do with this wetland for restoration. And Bruce was out there, Mike Shafley, and a lot of other people, Jeff Marcus and whatnot, and a lot of the managers. And, there was a lot of trepidation, like, do no harm, like Mike said. I don't want to do any harm, obviously. I love these sites, I love these species. But, I had some reservations, but I figured it couldn't get any worse. I mean, there's nothing using it that was rare or anything like that. So I don't want to do harm, but I would like to do some good, which I think is what we should be doing as managers. This is what Bruce just emailed me yesterday. I don't know these species. I'm not a botanist, but hairy smartweed increased greatly, which is apparently rare. He said we routinely see hundreds of plants, whereas before we had trouble finding a few. Mudbank crown grass, I have no idea what that is. I'd like for someone to show it to me. It came in from the seed bank. It's new to the site and the county. They discovered this dwarf burrhead. It's also new to the site, new to the county. Muhlenbergia turania, pine bearing smokegrass. This was an interesting one because it's an ecotone species that requires fire, and it was only hanging on in a few stems, like literally 50 stems, I guess. And we actually cordoned off this area where this species was hanging on so that the loggers wouldn't touch it, and they didn't. And it was there in the first couple of years. It really blew up. It started showing up all around the edge of the wetland, right in the ecotone where you expect it. But then we've had a lot of water the past number of years, and I think it's gotten, I think it's just one of these things where you can't find it anymore, but it'll probably come back, as conditions change over years. He says, overall, this project was a success for herps and rare plants. I think so too. So I would argue that restoration is necessary on a lot of these sites. The reason there aren't many places like 17 Frog Pond anymore is because of past land use and lack of fire, especially fire during the wrong season. But if you look at 1950, there's the wetland. 1988, that's what's left of it. Can't really see it. And 2020 looks very similar to 1950. And thanks to Brady for taking this photo also. So I think restoration is not only possible, I think it's necessary. And sometimes you've got to go hard-handed to restore an area, to get things back, to reset the system to where we can manage it in the future just using fire, no more equipment. So I want to thank a lot of people here, is in no particular order, but a lot of these people had a hand in this management. And our Sandhills game land crew, I can't give enough credit to them for doing all the work out there and helping out with lots of things that we need to do to keep these sites open, applying fire during the right seasons, and just being really open to our suggestions, and really good managers, in my opinion. And with that, stop sharing my screen. But anybody have any questions, I'm welcome to answer them. And I was going to say, since Mike Sisson he couldn't make this meeting, he had a slot. So I was going to hand it over to Jeff Marcus and to talk about some of the Carolina bays, if you would like to. But otherwise, I'm open for questions.
Sure, let's take a question or two and then we can switch over. Does that sound good to you, Jeff Marcus? Okay, I see a nod. Jeff Humphreys,
Yep.
Why did you remove the duff? Just to lower the elevation or for other reasons as well? I'm reading these from the chat.
Oh, interesting. I couldn't see the chat, sorry.
Oh, no.
So the duff layer, it basically, when water fills back up, when it's got tons and tons of pine needles and whatnot, The water can be very acidic. That's one thing, and that's not great for most of these pond breeding amphibians. Also, I just wanted to get down to the seed bank, and fire just wasn't doing it without that herbaceous vegetation there to begin with. There was nothing to carry the fire. So we wanted to get down to the seed bank so that that vegetation that was already in there would come up and provide a means for fire to roar through these sites and keep it open in the long term.
Second question, are invasive species a concern? What invasive species?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they could be, but we haven't really seen that much except stuff that was already there, like pear, stuff like that. No, we haven't had that problem. You get things like dog fennel coming in first, and what I call construction site grasses, but no, doesn't seem to be a problem.
Okay, and then one more. How often, how many times have prescribed burns been implemented at this site? And also, were all of the fires during summer months?
Yes, they were all during summer months. I should have written this down. That site has burned, at least since 2011, it's burned at least probably 3 or 4 times, I think. And they were all conducted during the summer months when the water was dry, or when the pond was dry. So the fire went, mainly completely through it. Might be some patches here and there that didn't burn.
One other thing I'll note, just that back to the invasive species thing, is that in some places where we've done restoration, at least 2 sites that I know of, we do have a plant that sometimes gets in the way. Cattails can be a problem. So you have to watch for those and remove them at first sight. Otherwise they can take over. But they didn't do that at this particular well.
Yeah, cattails tend to be a problem in ponds that never dry down. But not a problem in these isolated wetlands that do dry on occasion, or at least every couple of years.
Okay, Jeff Marcus, I'll let you take it away.
Well,
Thank you.
Maybe more important to be able to answer all questions than hear another example first. I think there's at least one more that came in the chat.
Okay, that sounds fine to me.
David asks, well, yeah, I'll go ahead and read it since I'm seeing it. Generally, how deep was the duff and how far did you dig to get to the seed bank?
I don't know the exact depth, but I would say at least 6 to 10 inches, sometimes more than that. And yeah, we just basically, the guys who were operating the equipment, it was very sort of surgical. They just had to find where the duff ended, where the soil started, and just keep that plane so that we're not disturbing the soil so much, and just getting rid of that duff and all the other organic matter that's grown up there over the decades.
Yeah, I guess a related question that Maria was noting, answer that Sarah gave about issues with buildup of organic material. She notes, a bit of an adjustment to wrap the head around, because folks are used to thinking of organic equals good, which it can in many wetlands. But maybe ephemeral wetlands can be a little different. Maybe you want to speak to that, Jeff?
Yeah, I was just reading that. That's a good point. Yeah, it's weird. I think we get used to seeing wetlands that have a lot of duff and have a lot of this organic matter in the bottom of them. And, that's probably perfectly normal in many cases. But I would argue that in a lot of places, that is not normal. That is a result of prior land use, and usually involving fire not being on the ground during the summer months when the pond is dry. And I think that's the big paradigm shift all the managers need to wrap their head around. I'm not targeting anybody in particular, but a lot of places just people are scared to burn during the summer, and I get that. But that's when a lot of these ponds need to burn to maintain that open, grassy, herbaceous cover. It's my take anyway.
Great. Jeff Marcus, yeah, I see you're sharing. Okay, good deal.
Yeah. Okay, so as Jeff Humphreys mentioned, Mike Sisson was gonna talk to us about some restoration examples. He's got a lot of experience in Mississippi, North Carolina, Florida doing this work. Unfortunately, I had something come up, and Jeff Humphreys asked me to pinch hit and give another example involving Carolina bays. The Bladen Lakes region has more bays. Should mention these are some clay-based bays in southern Scotland County, kind of sort of on the periphery, and the Bladen Lakes region has, in addition to clay-based, a lot of peat-based bays. So as Mike Shafley was referring to earlier, it can be complicated. You have lots of different natural communities. Understanding which ones you have are different. And also, before I jump into this one, should be worth mentioning that there's a range of restoration options depending on what a given site needs, and some of them can be very light touch, simply from just shifting the fire regime to more of summer burns when that can be feasible. It can involve just simply removing some of that thick, dense vegetation that grows on the edge to allow fire to penetrate better. It can involve some hand cutting of individual trees, all the way up to some of these heavier examples. And Jeff Humphreys asked me to talk about another rather intensive one. I think these are some of the more interesting cases that when they are intensive, but don't want to give you the impression that every restoration project is as major and involved as these two here. There is a range, but so this is a site in southern Scotland County. These Carolina bays, you can see these elliptical shaped items here. The red boundary is the boundary that the Nature Conservancy owned back in 2013. The topmost bay that you can see here is Tunstall Bay. That has been referred to before by Mike, others. And then this is Big Cypress Meadow, the next one down. Back in the day, these were some of the most beautiful bays that were described out there, really gorgeous, but each actually, close together, but each unique. It's also described much more of that open water, can be grassy type site, as Mike had mentioned, and Big Cypress Meadow, more of a cypress savanna. And so close neighbors, but each supporting very different plant and animal communities because of their different hydrologies and management histories. Some of the changes that, well, one thing that happened is that DOT decided to build a road. So this sort of thing's labeled Wagram Road here. Is Highway 401, kind of a major highway thoroughfare going through here, and that not only sort of dissected some of the bays, in the area, and split sort of the connectivity, but there were indirect effects. They created a huge headache for anyone who wanted to think about prescribed fire and burning these sites. And with Nature Conservancy owning at the time just a portion of Tunstall and maybe a third of Big Cypress Meadow, really hard to do much. There was some timber activity that had tried to open this up back in the 90s, but you can see by 2013, Tunstall Bay was starting to get very grown in. You see there is this more open patch that stayed a little bit open and grassy in there, but a lot of encroachment from a lot of loblolly pines around the edges. And Big Cypress Meadow was almost entirely closed canopy, dense and thick. In 2015, the Nature Conservancy was able to acquire this. Hervey McKeever engineered a complex deal to purchase this land to the north that includes all of Tunstall Bay and more of Big Cypress Meadow. And we were just coming off a period of some extended drought, so these sites were really dry, and it was an opportunity to get in there and Jeff says sort of reset the system. So this was, as you can see, and that arrow, by the way, is pointing kind of to the same point on the map just to kind of keep you oriented. And we were able to do a commercial timber sale of both the uplands around the pond, which are sort of dense, kind of hardwood grown in thing, and as well as within the basins because it was dry enough to get in there. This was certainly not a carpet cleaner project. Probably would not have been practical or possible. And sort of an opportunity that came around when it was dry to be able to do something. And so you can see this is a fairly dramatic landscape change. And whether we did harm or not, again, I think that's a question I'd like to sort of present to each of you to consider here. But I would say that we can do harm by doing the wrong thing, and I feel like we can also do harm by doing nothing. So let's kind of see what these places look like. So this was Tunstall Bay pre-treatment. This was the open area. You can see to the left was that kind of open grassy portion of it, and the encroachment of these loblollies creeping ever closer to the center. Then that loblolly area, just as Jeff had pointed out on the previous, you can see the high water marks where water was still getting in here and filling up the bay, but it just wasn't staying long. These trees were sucking it out. The structure wasn't there for supporting breeding. This is a site that used to support gopher frog, ornate chorus frog, a number of other species that had been lost, and a few like tiger salamander, southern chorus frog were hanging on. This is what it looked like after the timber operation. So it was cut in that summer of 2016. That fall and winter, we started getting, started to be a fairly wet period, getting a fair amount of rain, filled it up, didn't have much of a growing season to respond. That's what it looked like in 2020. Between them, Hurricane Florence came that following year in 2018. And basically the pond has stayed wet almost continuously since that. So instead of, this seasonal dry down, it's been almost continuously wet during this time period. You are seeing a lot of vegetation grow in around the edges, but actually out in the middle, it was really suppressing a lot of that herbaceous growth because of that high water mark for so long. So it kept trees out, but also was suppressing some of that herbaceous growth. And this is just something for us to consider, that as we get a changing climate, we see more of these extremes, really intense storm events that put a lot of water out there and it stays wet for a long period of time, longer than normally. That affects the vegetation community, as does these more extended droughts. And then here, finally, in this summer, it finally dried down, and this is kind of what it looks like. And it does need these periodic dry periods in order for this herbaceous vegetation to grow up. There's a number of different interesting plants out there. It's a little hard to kind of see from here, but one of the plants, the little white dots out here, is lots of Carolina redroot, just sort of peppering all over the place. Lots of pollinators, really kind of neat looking. So next door, big cypress meadow, that pond to the south. This is what it looked like pre-treatment. The edge was so thick and dense, you couldn't hardly make your way through it. You can see that there's still cypress in here, but really choked by a lot of loblolly, sweet gum, red maple among the other trees that were in here. And this is what it looked like after the thinning, to actually open up and restore, probably its namesake cypress meadow, cypress savanna condition. Again, that same picture from that same January 2017, finally filling with water, not much herbaceous response, but looks very different. We can actually see out across the site. Here we are in August 2020, still, holding more water than I think it ever did. It's held very little water for short periods of time before. Now it was actually holding a fair amount of water, but maybe you can see a lot of sweet gums that are starting to grow back in along these edges, starting to encroach back, and a lot of dents, and really kind of wringing our hands as to what we're going to do about that, given the challenges with burning at this site. In September of 2021, you can see portions of it, again, looking fairly nice, open pond water. This water's been sitting there for a little while. Got some interesting things like about 70 wood storks post-breeding showed up and hung out for a little while in big cypress meadows. We never seen before out there. And then this is what it looked like this summer. This is actually taken from the same place, that other panorama. And it's actually worth noting that a lot of these dead stalks here, those are those sweet gums. So this is actually a case where high water for a long enough period of time killed back those sweet gums. This property, I should mention, has since been transferred to the Plant Conservation Program, and PCP is currently in the process of doing some mechanical mulching to knock back additional sweet gums and loblollies that are encroaching on the edges of both of these sites. What did we see from the species? As I mentioned, gopher frog and ornate chorus frog had been extirpated. So even when you get habitat back, if the species are gone, the landscape is too fragmented for them to recolonize. So they'll have to be reintroduced if they'll ever be there again. Tiger salamander, we've been getting about 50 egg masses a year beforehand. Water was so high, it was really hard to count and detect them, as sort of just was referring to the other site. Southern chorus frogs is one that's a bit of a concern. It's not been heard since the timber sales. Heard before, but not since. Maybe this is an area where we did do some harm. Think about a lot of these timber operations happening when you have a limited amount of upland habitat, and all these adults are in the uplands. You do make them vulnerable to harming those adult populations, and don't know if that's what happened here, but that's one that's a concern. On the plus side of the ledger, we've seen a lot more bird activity. We had breeding pair of pied-billed grebes. This is a species that's normally just a winter resident, hardly ever breeds in North Carolina. We had a breeding record at this site. A lot of use by various species of herons and egrets, ducks. Like I said, those wood storks showing up. Some of the herbaceous plants that showed up. Bruce Story also did some work out here. You can see a number of the plants that seem to have expanded and become more abundant since this work. Canby's dropwort is a federally endangered plant was at Big Cypress Meadow, used to be there, hasn't been seen in 20 plus years. So that's kind of where we are with that one. I realize I'm at time here, but I think one of the things you might be seeing is that there's maybe not easy answers or a simple one solution, but you know, I'd say that in this one, there's a lot of checks on the positive side of the ledger from that project.
All right, good stuff, Jeff. If you have questions for Jeff, if you'll stick them in the chat, or we may have time sort of at the end of our session today. But I do want to keep us rolling and keep us right on time. So I'm going to ask Sarah if she'll share her screen, and Ken Sugart is going to be talking to us a little bit about using fire in some of these systems. Ken, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I've got you.
Okay, take it away, Ken.
So I've done a fair amount of burning. I work for the Wildlife Resources Commission. I'm a forest manager in the southern coastal plain of North Carolina, of course. And I've done a fair amount of burning on the uplands and try to incorporate as many of the wetlands as I possibly can. So if we can see the next slide, they wanted me to talk a little bit about how to introduce fire and how to burn these things. And like was mentioned earlier, a lot of people are really concerned, scared to put fire in these wetlands. And it can be kind of intimidating to start. So some things to consider. The season that you burn, there's been a lot of talk about burning in the summer growing season. And that's great. If you are starting from scratch and these wetlands have been neglected, fire neglected, there's a good chance you're going to have a lot of the waxy, shrubby fuels in there. And the reason I put the season is in the spring, when things are greening up, those waxy, shrubby plants are a lot more volatile than they are winter or summer. So you can have a lot more fire intensity in the spring. When you're burning these wetlands, it was mentioned there's a good chance that there's some duff in there. And if it's dry, some of that duff is a good chance it's going to burn. So you can have an extended period of fire. So it's important to look at your future weather. Look for, ideally, you get some rain soon after to put the fire out. Or something that's even more important to me is if you do have an extended fire and you see a dry wind event window coming up, you may not want to burn it then because you have a good chance of it getting away. Obviously, soil moisture is something to consider. I know it's been mentioned about using mechanical to remove duff, and that's a good option. But if you can catch it right, you can also remove some of the duff with fire. The downside is if it's too dry when you use fire to remove the duff, you can remove all the duff at once and you have a lot of fire you have to babysit for a while. Another thing to consider, obviously, is your ability to hold the fire. So you have to look not just at your wetland, but what surrounds it. And are you going to be able to hold that fire within that wetland, or are you going to incorporate the wetland into a larger burn unit? And of course, in case you do have an extended burn, your smoke sensitive areas. You don't want to be smoking people out with ground fire smoke days after you burn. And can we have the next slide? So there's a good example of the volatility of some waxy fuels. Like I said, when they're coming out of the dormancy in the spring, and also again in the fall, those fuels tend to be a lot more volatile. And you can have some pretty intense fire. What's the next slide? Okay, as I mentioned, the weather. Ideally, you catch it right before a rain. So you burn a little of the duff off and rain puts it out. And I put good luck there because that never works for me. I've been doing it a long time and you never get the rain when you think you're going to get it. And again, avoid burning just ahead of a strong wind event unless you have a lot of black around you and you're not worried about it getting away from you. What's the next slide? There's an example of maybe burning it when it was too dry. Now, obviously, if you're not concerned about trees and you want to kill the trees, this is not necessarily a bad thing. But you can see how much duff was removed with that burn. I removed probably 6 or 8 inches of duff with that one fire. Ideally, in an ideal world, you'd remove, an inch or 2 at a time. But again, if you're not worried about the canopy trees and you burn it all at once, then mission accomplished. I mentioned here being wary of relying on KBDI. That's a measurement of soil moisture that's not very reliable. It's kind of an indicator of whether or not you'll have ground fire. And in my experience, it's not worth. I'd much rather go by knowledge and looking at the site ahead of time than relying on KBDI. So KBDI is on a scale of 0 to 600, 600 being the driest. And I have had ground fire when the KBDI was below 100, which in theory should never happen, but it's happened to me. So don't rely on KBDI. We have the next slide. That looks like it's crazy, but I was burning, that isn't so much an ephemeral wetland, but I was burning into a big wetland. I was actually burning into a pond on that one. And that fire was actually intentional. I wanted to burn it really hot because it had been fire suppressed for years and years, had a terrible mid-story. And in that case, I was actually running that fire into a pond. So although it looks crazy and like it's out of control, it really wasn't. It ran out into the pond. It burned all the transition zone, knocked the mid-story way back. The pond pine, for the most part, survived. I'd say 90% of them survived. And now I've got an open canopy with a transition zone that's had a tremendous response with forbs and grasses. And I mentioned there also, try to avoid your mechanical disturbance in the transition zone. And I know we've talked about using mechanical stuff to restore wetlands and all, but as a general rule of thumb, I don't like putting equipment in the transition zones, which is the zone between the upland and the wetland. And that's where a lot of our rare plants occur. So I try to stay out of those with mechanical equipment. We have the next slide. So that is the previous fire, post-fire. That's what it looked like. Looks like I've killed everything out there, but I didn't. And so we mentioned about holding the fire. You can burn the uplands around your pond or wetland ahead of time so you have black. And even if it's damp and it doesn't burn through it, you can always come back later when it does dry up and then just burn the wetland and knock some of the fuels back out of that. And that's an example where you can see the sand up along the edge. You could burn all that upland first and then come back at a later date and burn the wetland. We have the next slide. So again, this is just another example where mechanical treatment was necessary. And we're going to look at this site tomorrow on the field trip. But the picture on the left is what that wetland looked like before. The picture on the right is after. That was done with a chainsaw and then just tractor and bush hog around the edges. So you can see what it, obviously it was overtaken with a lot of hardwoods. The duff was very thick. It just was a wetland in very poor condition. And with just a little bit of tractor work and some chainsaw work, the picture on the right is the result. Could I have next slide? So you start messing with this stuff, you're going to have challenges. I call this a failure, but it's really not. I killed the shrubs and I killed a lot of the hardwoods out of this wetland. it was just aggravating because we had ground fire that we had to babysit for about 2 weeks. So you're not always going to hit it just right to where you can burn a little bit of duff and then walk away. Sometimes if you mess with this stuff and you have wetlands that are in poor condition, you're going to have some challenges until you get the duff removed. We have the next slide. So I kept it short because I figured there'd be some questions. And so anyway, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Ken. If folks have questions, they can either pop them into the chat or you can raise your hand and I can call on folks to ask questions. Any questions out there? Okay, here's one coming in, Ken. Do you have tools or rules of thumb for assessing duff moisture?
There are some rules. Again, some people use KBVI. I don't rely on it. I go more seat of the pants. I go out ahead of time, go into these wetlands, and I basically look for soil moisture and I see where it's at. I'll dig down a little bit and see where my water level is, or see where it gets good and moist where I think it won't burn. And you know, a lot of times what happens is if you have wetlands that are in poor condition, you're going to have hardwoods out there, like has been discussed, and you're going to have duff that builds up around the bases of those trunks. So pretty much those spots are going to burn because they're built up at a little bit higher elevation. And then once it gets down away from the base of the trees, it doesn't tend to burn. So ideally, that's what I try to do. I try to burn to where I just take a little bit off each time. So you can kind of just dig down in the duff or in the soil and see where your moisture level is. Ideally, it's dry on the top few inches and then it gets moist underneath.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Any other questions out there? Got some great tips, getting some kudos. Here's one. Has anyone looked at ecological effects of fire in the wetlands on insects pre-post restoration? And any thoughts on how this affects prey availability for reptiles and amphibians?
So I can say for sure that fire, and this isn't so much in the wetlands, but just in general, really helps. And in my case, since I have to be in the woods every day, does a great job because it kills lots of ticks and red bugs. Some of these sites, when I first started working in them, I just stayed covered in ticks and red bugs. And now that we've got a good fire regime over a longer period of time, it seems like they're not there near like they used to. Other insects, I can't really speak for.
Someone asks, what holding equipment do you have on these burns?
So it depends on the burn. I always have a fire tractor and plow available, but I rarely ever use it. I try to use existing brakes, natural brakes as much as possible, like streams, wetlands, ponds, or I'll use roads. A lot of times we'll use fire lanes that we might have to take a tractor and a disc to disc ahead of time. But I've really tried to eliminate plowing. We used to do a lot of fire plowing. That just used to be standard protocol. And like was mentioned earlier by somebody else, all the wetlands got plowed out. It was thought to be a bad idea to put fire in there. So there's lots of old fire lines where everything was plowed. And a lot of times those plow lines were in that transition zone or ecotone that where it really shouldn't have been. So really try to get away from all that and just use natural brakes as much as possible.
Well, sort of a follow-up to that, can you speak more about burning uplands separate from the wetlands, especially if conditions needed are different for each?
So what I've done, and I know it's been mentioned by several people that growing season fire is better than dormant, and I agree 100%. However, if you're trying to introduce fire where there hasn't been fire for a long time, you may have to do dormant season growing first. especially if you have any value of your canopy trees, you know, for financial reasons or whatever. Because if you start a fire program somewhere where there hasn't been fire, initially the growing season, there's a good chance you're going to kill about everything out there. So that being said, if you're starting from scratch and you've got some isolated wetlands within uplands, you can start with a dormant season fire. So typically the wetlands will be wet and you kind of reduce your fuel loads around them. And then you can come back later that summer and burn the wetlands after, when you have everything around there, the fuel's reduced around.
Perfect. Oh, one more here. Any comments on frequency of burning to reduce post-burn depression of animals? And this says insects, herbs, mammals, etc.
Well, as somebody mentioned earlier, I can't remember who, but you know, fire naturally occurred in these sites every 1 to 3 years. So I am trying to mimic the same thing. Most of my stuff is on a 3-year burn rotation. I've got a few sites that I try to burn more often, just for experimental reasons. Mainly I use 3 years just because I can't get to everything on a 3-year rotation, let alone burn it more frequently. So I just believe in trying to mimic natural fire as much as possible. So I like to burn early summer when the natural lightning strikes occurred. And I try to do it every 3 years. Of course, I'm limited in some cases because a lot of the game lands I work on are fairly new acquisitions, so they don't have a long fire history. So I have to still do a fair amount of dormant season burning until I get everything, the fuels knocked back and the right canopy trees and all. Because another thing that hasn't been mentioned is, again, if you value your canopy trees, loblolly is far less tolerant to fire than longleaf or pond pine. So you've got to be careful about your canopy trees with fire for sure.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. Really, really awesome stuff. And I'm sure Ken will be happy to continue answering if you have more things you want to throw in there, or like I say, towards the end, we might have a few minutes for questions as well. We're going to transition into a slightly different piece here. Do a round robin from some of the folks that manage some of the lands specifically in the Bladen Lakes region. And so we're going to hear from private lands and state-owned lands and things along those lines. So to begin with, we're going to start off with a private landowner, Richard Broadwell. Richard, if you want to go ahead and share your screen. And he manages, owns and manages some land right there close to some state-owned game lands. So I will let you, Richard, sort of take it away. And let's see, I need to make sure I let you allow yourself. Now you can unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Let's see, I just think I need to do a. Is that working for everyone?
It's just about to, we got it in presentation working mode, or what, you know, when you're designing it.
Okay. Sorry, guys.
Not a problem at all.
All right, a little bit better.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, all right, super. So thank you for the opportunity. We wanted to talk about our property known as Bayfields. It's a tract of land in northern Bladen County, which is currently owned by myself and my two brothers. And over the years, thanks to the generosity of expertise and advice and help, we've tried to do some of the management on our private property that's been discussed in this workshop. And I was just asked to go over a little bit about kind of what we've undertaken over the years. So I'm going to give you just a very brief overview of the property and then talk about 4 aspects of management that we've undertaken, including the use of prescribed fire use in our wetlands, a lot of work that my father did to establish Atlantic white cedar plantations on the property, and then delve into some of our borrowed pit management and some of our artificial ephemeral wetlands, as well as some of our natural ephemeral wetlands. And I believe some of you are going to be going on the field trip tomorrow, and so you'll be visiting one of the borrow pits that's on our property that we've done some work on over the years. The property that we own in total is about 4,000 acres. We're situated just south of Suggs Mill Pond Game Lands, and helps to form that natural corridor that Jeff Marcus was talking about earlier, which includes both the state forest land to the south, Bladen Lakes, the game lands to the north, and some nature conservancy land also scattered in the area. We do have a pretty significant portion of the property under a conservation easement with the Nature Conservancy, and that's the black hatched part of the property that you can see on the screen. The property actually originated as a duck hunting impoundment starting back in the early 1970s. My father and his brother started purchasing land to set up a duck hunting impoundment. They were home builders in Fayetteville and just wanted a place to escape on the weekend and get away from their screaming kids and have fun out in the woods. My uncle Waverly actually studied forestry at the University of Georgia, even though he eventually went into home building. And my father loved working the land and doing controlled burning, and they loved both hunting waterfowl as well as quail. Over the years, especially beginning in the 1990s, my father started acquiring other parts of what we currently own. He threw out that old saying, he didn't want to own all the land, just the parts that touched him. And he started, one of the bigger purchases that he made was in the late 1990s. He split some of the old Canal Woods Timber Company with the Wildlife Resources Commission. Part of it went to form Suggs Mill Pond Game Land, and the area to the south became part of my father's property. So a significant portion of our property was formerly owned by Canal Woods Timber Company, but there are scattered old home sites, old farms that we are now in ownership of. And it has a very complicated management history. Some very kind of confusing timber types are on the property, and we're dealing with the legacy of that management today. Kind of zooming in on the central part of the property, we've got a pretty interesting mix of different timber types and habitats on the property, a significant portion of which are wetlands. My father started on a multi-decade effort to restore longleaf pine on the property. He had an especially strong fondness for bobwhite quail and was interested in restoring them to the landscape, and really exhausted himself over several decades reestablishing longleaf on the property, kind of cycling off the loblolly and slash pine as the opportunity came up. And I would say at this point, we're about 95% complete with longleaf establishment. I think he, I wouldn't say he got bored with doing it, but he wanted to kind of launch into something else. And we can't really pin down the exact origins of it, but he became kind of infatuated with establishing Atlantic white cedar plantations on the property. And I don't want to say it's restoration, because a lot of these plantations are found on parts of the property where I don't think they would have necessarily been naturally occurring, certainly not at the density and composition that they are now. But we have about 1,000 acres of longleaf pine and about 1,000 acres of Atlantic white cedar. So if anyone has any questions as to whether or not you can establish Atlantic white cedar, we can definitely say that that is a possibility. I'm going to talk about a little bit about our use of prescribed fire on the property, and this will match up very closely with what Ken Sugart was talking about. We try to mimic a lot of the management that's done next door on the state game lands. As I mentioned, a lot of our property was previously owned by a timber company, and they had a network of internal fire lanes on the property, sometimes paralleling roads, oftentimes separating our wetland areas from the uplands. And just kind of out of habit, my father, who loved doing burning himself, continued to use a lot of those fire lanes over the years and refreshed them, and kind of perpetuated that separation of upland from wetlands in terms of where fire was actually applied on the landscape. We didn't really early on have a rigorous rotation on our burning. Some areas were burned much more frequently than others. And so it was a real hodgepodge of different types of fuel loads that are found on the property when my brothers and I inherited it. So we've switched over to a more regular rotation since then. And we're trying to do, as we kind of move through our burns, get our fuel loads down by conducting mostly dormant season burning. But when those conditions get safer, we're moving more and more of our fires into April and even into May as best we can. There's some logistical problems in Bladen County that make that particularly difficult with the organic soils in the area. So this is a zoomed in map of the portions of the property that we have under a planned fire rotation, a 3-year rotation. And so the patterned area are those parts of the property where we'll be conducting controlled burns. So this year, or this coming winter in 2023, we'll be burning more of the western part of what you see there. And you may be able to see some pretty obvious ovals on the property. Those are some pretty classic Carolina bays that are found there. And some of those are planted in Atlantic white cedar. Some are in loblolly pine plantations. And we have to exclude fire from those at this point in time. Per year, we're trying to burn approximately 700 acres. Which I know for some of you really doesn't sound like a lot, but because of our burn units being only about 25 or 30 acres in size, that turns out to be 25 plus burns during the dormant and early growing season, which is actually quite a stretch for our little burn crew, but we're doing the best that we can. As I mentioned, a lot of our wetlands had been excluded from having fire in them for a long period of time. And so our scattered patches of kind of our more unusual carnivorous plants like these pitcher plants were actually being subsumed by the shrubbery. And so we have made an effort to basically ignore where possible and retire those internal fire lines and burn right through that ecotone into the wetlands and get a lot more sunlight in there to help those species. So in this particular photo, the little wetland pocket on the left had not had fire in it for a long period of time. It had been disked around by the timber company, and we continue to exclude fire from it. And just in the past 3 years, we've started running fire into that pocket, and it's actually had a pretty dramatic effect on the understory vegetation that's found in there. And I think it's actually a little bit wetter in there also because of just a reduction in some of the transpiration of the vegetation. And that's just a nice little pretty green up of one of those wetland areas. I was asked to focus a little bit on our Atlantic white cedar plantations. These were planted at the recommendation of forestry professors at NC State and the North Carolina Forest Service at a 6 by 6 foot spacing. And these were mostly planted in what I would call degraded pond pine woodland and bay forest parts of the property, which were mostly covered in things like smilax with very little canopy in them. This did require quite a lot of site preparation, including KG and drum chopping, as well as V-shearing and bedding with a savanna bedder to just get the seedlings up where they would not drown out in those wetland areas. We do have some natural stands of Atlantic white cedar on the property. And as you can imagine, they're found on the wettest kind of parts of the landscape that would not have had a lot of natural or escape fire on them. The trees have a very thin bark and do not usually survive a growing season fire of much intensity. It provides great habitat for a variety of animals. If you're interested in establishing Atlantic white cedar on your property, I believe the cones are eaten by quite a few songbirds. And I believe there's an unusual butterfly species called the Hessel's hairstreak, whose larvae only feed on Atlantic white cedar. So I believe if you don't have that species of tree in your landscape, you're not going to have that endangered butterfly. So hopefully we have a pretty robust population of Hessel's hairstreak right now, although I don't know that for a fact. Like I said, this is a plantation establishment. This is not really reestablishing a natural community. There was a lot of disturbance done to the site through disking and plowing and planting, but the success early on was pretty high. Just moving on to some of the management issues that people, including us, have experienced is a pretty rapid growth of any residual vines like smilax or grapevine. And so they had to follow up with some pretty heavy spraying of chopper and Garlon 4 to knock back that competition. Another issue, which we kind of cautioned our father about and he ignored us about, was the risk of fire, because we are oftentimes burning immediately adjacent to our Atlantic white cedar stands. And you can see the person standing on the right is actually at the edge of one of our Atlantic white cedar plantations. And there's a mixture of not just Atlantic white cedar, but a lot of volunteer loblolly pine. And it is chock full of fuel, and all it would take would be one little spark in the growing season to get into that stand. And I think they'd have to call in a plane to even attempt to put out the fire that might occur in that. If anyone is thinking about establishing Atlantic white cedar, I would restrict your planting to the absolute wettest part of your landscape, just to simplify burning of adjacent areas and to reduce the chance of wildfire taking out any kind of Atlantic white cedar that you might plant. Some other issues that may or may not be of interest to you, unless you're interested in it from an economic standpoint. Some of our plantations do have a high proportion of multi-stem trees where there was one seedling planted, but it's turned into basically a bush, which down the road that might be, you might have difficulty merchandising something like that. We don't know exactly why that is. It could have been browsed by deer or rabbit early on that caused it to branch off in that way. And then another issue, if you're interested in growing the wood for timber, is that we do have quite a lot of persistent limbs extending up pretty high into the canopy. And these knots can affect the wood quality and I guess the price that you could get down the road. From an economic standpoint, these trees have a very long rotation. You're going to leave them there for at least 50 years, maybe 70 years, and you do not thin them because they are not very wind firm, and they need all of their buddy trees around them to help them grow. Also, that shading presumably helps to keep some of the limbs from persisting in the understory. But you've got a really long rotation that extends past my lifetime on this planet to whoever gets this property after us. And so it's a very challenging tree to grow from an economic standpoint. Another thing which you should consider if you're doing plantations is if you do plant it at the recommended density, these plantations, to my eye, are largely a wildlife desert. This is in the early spring. There's very little to nothing else growing in the understory. Things like bear and deer might hide out in here, and maybe up in the canopy, you'll have some Hessel's hair streak flying around. But the rest of this former bay forest or pond pine woodland is really pretty devoid of any kind of wildlife that would interest most people. Moving on to borrow pit management, we've been trying to do a lot of the stuff that has been recommended here in terms of removing shrub and tree stems, working to promote grasses and sedges, partly through the use of prescribed fire, and then where necessary, doing some limited application of what are more aquatic safe herbicides. We do have quite a few borrow pits scattered around the property, and we do have some that are in this condition, which I think is kind of ideal. They dry out in the summertime. They're dominated by grasses and sedges, and we actually have pretty nice populations of various species of frogs and salamanders that live in them. Unfortunately, most of our borrow pits look more like this one. There are a lot of volunteer trees coming up. There's very little grass around the edges, and there's predominantly shrubs growing around the perimeter. That particular pond, which some of you will be visiting tomorrow, has a population of ornate forest frog. And I didn't actually know that until someone from the Natural Heritage Program informed us about the presence of the frog. The Natural Heritage Program and Wildlife Resources Commission, they've given us some great advice on how to manage this and our other wetlands on the property. And that kind of has sparked us to go off in the direction of trying to manage these as best we can. We have conducted one fire around the perimeter just to try and knock back our shrubs. It was modestly successful. Unfortunately, it had to be in the dormant season just because that area had not had fire in many decades. But we're hoping to do another burn this coming year if we can get enough rain and move it more into the growing season. For most of our bigger trees, we're going to have to wait until we conduct a harvest around a commercial harvest in the surrounding plantations to take those trees out. But for our small saplings and our shrubbery, we've actually just gone in and done mechanical felling when we're in the area. And the fellow standing there really liked herps, so he especially loved doing that work and was very happy to do it. We have done some limited stump application of herbicides around a couple of our borrow pits, being very careful to use herbicides and surfactants that are potentially less harmful because of their formulation. We actually tried to do a sponge type applicator of herbicide, just hand cutting the shrubbery and applying it to the stems. But to be honest with you, it wasn't very successful. I don't think it was enough herbicide, and a lot of that stuff has grown back. So what we've done is we waited until that particular pond dried down this summer, and we've carefully sprayed the vegetation with some aquatic safe herbicide. And so far, we've been able to open up the understory a bit, let in quite a lot more light than was there, maybe stir up some of the seed bank, and hopefully after our fire this coming year, we'll get some more grasses move in and make the habitat around the pond a little bit more suitable for the forest frog, and maybe the populations will actually increase. And lastly, just want to talk about some of our natural ephemeral wetland management. This has been one of the more interesting and fun things to work on. And we have managed this particular wetland solely with the use of prescribed burning and some mechanical removal of trees and shrubs. We haven't done any herbiciding out there. This is I believe a 1993 aerial photo of this area. It's located off of Gum Spring Road. We had long called this the frog pond because during the summertime, if we had a heavy rainstorm, the frogs would just come pouring out of there. And you can see it kind of has three natural wetter lobes that in this area were quite flooded. You might even be able to make out some old drainage ditches that date all the way back to the 1930s.
And
it's still
Richard,
out
just
there.
real quick,
Yeah.
if you could attempt to wrap up in the next couple minutes, that'd be great. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. So we had some folks from Wildlife Resources Commission came out and gave us some advice, and somebody from the Heritage Program. We conducted a pretty intense growing season fire to top kill the vegetation to be able to get in some mechanical equipment. We cut it down with our Brown's tree cutter, which is a souped up bush hog. And then we conducted another growing season burn to burn off the remainder of just the woody debris. Did a little bit of hand felling, followed up with another early growing season burn. And you can see how well that site has recovered. And we still do have a shrub component, but it's just a much smaller stature than before. And Jeff, I think that's it.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing about that. So much awesome stuff going on there. I'm going to hold questions till we get through this session and then see what we have available once we get there. So next up, we have Ed Corey with State Parks to share a little bit about some of the things going on there. Ed, if you want to share your screen.
1 second. It should be visible now. Let me know whenever.
Yep, we can see it. You're not in presentation mode yet, but
Yeah, I was waiting on that. All right. I'm going to give basically a helicopter tour of our Bladen County State Park units, and it's going to be a quick and dirty conversation. It's a lot of slides, but they're going to go pretty quickly. I'm the inventory monitoring ecologist for State Park, so my job is mostly focused with rare species, but today we're going to be looking at these habitats and talking about their importance. So the division owns 4 park units in Bladen County and manages 3 of them. White Lake, which you'll see here by my pointer, is mostly surrounded by private land, so we don't have a whole lot of impact on the management around it. But we have Jones Lake State Park over here to the northwest. We've got Singletary Lake down here in the southeast, and we've got Bay Tree Lake up in the northeastern part of the county, or part of the screen. Jones Lake we'll focus on first. Opened in 1939, currently consists of about 1,387 acres of upland that is surrounding 2 distinct lakes. The smaller Jones Lake at 220 acres and Salters at 323 acres. Some of the significant wetland species that have been reported on site include four-toed salamander, oak toad, Brimley's chorus frog, and threadleaf sundew. So definitely some wetlands in the area. Just another quick look at Singletary Lake. It's been owned by the division since 1954. The lake itself is about 570 acres and is surrounded by almost 750 acres of uplands. 2 of the significant species that are associated with wetlands here are Venus flytrap and oak toad, but they mostly consist in some of these wetter areas. The flytraps are typically around the lake, and the oak toads are usually found in depressions. But the park we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about is Bay Tree Lake. And Bay Tree is one of our oldest and least developed state parks. It's been in the division since around 1937. It's treated as a primitive park. There's no camping, no facilities. Access is walking. So it's nice open land to kind of navigate. You see the 1,400 plus acre lake on the east side of the image there. And it has a private community on its north shore. State Park owns about 600 acres on the western edge of the Bay Lake, as you can see. As we zoom in a little closer, we start to begin to notice a couple of wetlands here along NC 41. We'll see a couple here, one there, and you see some on the other side of the road as well. What we're seeing here in this northern one, the smaller one, which is around a little bit less than 2 acres, is a fairly small wetland, but it has supported several species of amphibians in the past, including ornate and southern chorus frog, maybe salamander as recently as 2011, and gopher frog in the far past, as well as the rare owned meadow beauty, which Catherine mentioned earlier. The slightly larger southern wetland there is about 7.5 acres and has a lot of potential for amphibian breeding habitat. It's a little bit deeper of a depression. But both of these are going to require some work, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. As a response to the lack of fire over many years, the smaller wetland, that northern one that's just a little under 2 acres, has had an influx of loblolly pines, which are acting like straws in a drinking cup, pulling up all the available water that could be filling these depressions. So in the last couple of years, our crews, our natural resource crews, have began cutting out these site inappropriate pines. And we're making a big dent, but still some work to be done. You can see here that the vegetation, the wetland vegetation, is still persisting even as we drop these pines in the bay or the depression itself. You see here some more of that wetland vegetation. As we move to the larger wetland, that 7.5 acre one, we see that there's a lot of pond cypress in this system, which you may see if you're familiar with the Sandhills bays, such as Antioch, Hambies, and Goose Pond. You'll notice a similar composition there. Due to the lack of fire, we also see red maple, black gum, and loblolly. And as Mike mentioned earlier, loblollies can be especially problematic in these wetlands, so we're hoping to address this. We're still trying to figure out what to do with the red maple and black gum as we look forward. But our hopes are in the next year or so to begin site inappropriate vegetation removal, and also maybe try to open up some of this shrub layer as well to skylight the wetland and allow for drier conditions for burning, and also to hopefully have fewer straws in the cup to maybe raise that water level up a little bit. Here's another view of that larger wetland. Again, this is a quick overview of just our properties and focusing on Bay Tree, but please let me know if you have any questions, and I have my email address here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed. What great stuff there. As with previously, I'm going to hold the questions so we get to the end of this piece. Ken, do you have your slides this time, or does Sarah have those?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have any slides for this part, so
Oh,
I'm
no
just
problem.
going to talk a little bit about Suggs and Whitehall and the history of it and what we're dealing with.
No problem.
So, quick overview. Suggs Mill Pond, which is adjacent to the Broadwell property, which you just saw some slides of, was acquired by the Wildlife Resources Commission in 1998, and it was acquired from Canal Wood Corporation, which is a commercial timber company. So as you can imagine, it was intensively managed for commercial timber harvest. Most of it was slash pine and loblolly pine. Intensive site prep. A lot of it was bedded. Some of it was sheared and pushed off and had hedgerows. Intensive management. A lot of the ground cover was lost. Closed canopy. So when we got it in, started down there in about 99, we have basically been trying to convert it back to what it should be. So there's been a lot of burning, a ton of thinning, a lot of removing. I've got almost all the slash pine gone, and working on the last little bit of slash, but all of it's been thin. Some of it I'm working on a second thinning now. So we've knocked the basal areas back to get some open canopy. The soils are pretty poor. They're sandy and dry, and it took some time, but our ground cover is really starting to come around. We went from sites that looked like they could break pine straw into some really good vegetation out there now. I have done some ground cover restoration by planting native grasses, but a lot of it came back, it was still in the seed bank. And by opening up the canopy and introducing fire and all, the plants, in a lot of cases, came back on their own. We've got 2 bay lakes on it. We've got the Suggs Mill Pond itself and Little Singletary Lake. And there's a lot of Carolina bays in it as well. And that's what I was talking about earlier. I don't plow those bays out if at all possible. I incorporate them into our burns to burn all the transition zones. And some cases I burned all the way through the bays where I could get it all the way around them. And I've seen a huge difference in those as well. As far as Whitehall Plantation game land goes, it's a more recent acquisition. And it is over near Singletary Lake State Park, which you just saw some pictures of. And it basically goes from Upland all the way to the Cape Fear River. So we have bottomland hardwood on part of it, all the way to Longleaf Pine on the higher sites. It too was commercial timberland. It was all loblolly, a little bit of slash. And I have converted a good portion of that to longleaf. And I've had to plant some native grasses in there as well. And of course, I burned all of that site as well. It's the whole site. Every place that should have fire has had fire on Whitehall as well. And we're starting to see it really turn the corner and get back to more what it should be versus what it was. Some of the issues we've had to deal with obviously were the ground cover lost due to bedding and intensive site prep and lack of fire and closed canopy and all. And I guess I would just say, if you're starting in on this, don't get discouraged. It's not an overnight thing. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, but if you keep at it and stick with it, you will see results. That's all I had.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Ken. All right, we're going to switch right on over to you, Hans. If you've got your screen up, if you want to share your screen, that'd be great.
Let me see if I get it done again here.
All right.
No. Well, I had one more picture in there. I don't know how I get that in there, but let me start otherwise. So I'm Hans Christian Rohr. I'm the forest supervisor at Bladen Lakes State Forest. Also the one with the funny accent. I'm from Germany originally, but have been here for half of my life. And I just wanted to talk really quickly this afternoon about what Sarah asked me about, three things mainly: the management, restoration needs, knowledge gaps, and accomplishments at Bladen Lakes. And yeah, we have some of each of them. Let me start with the management and restoration needs. Yeah, Bladen Lakes State Forest, we have several. We have many bays and other wetlands. And one restoration need which comes up right now is trying to restore that rice pond bay. We call it that. But let me show you the right picture here. It's this thing. Since Hurricane Florence in 2018, that whole bay was underwater for more than 2 years. And it was a loblolly plantation.
Hans, you're it's just showing your folder.
Oh,
of the pictures.
What we're seeing is that screen on your far right.
Oh, just this one. Okay.
That's what we're seeing in the house and all those pictures.
So how, okay.
I think if you stop sharing again and then restart and pick the wherever you got the picture open, it should fix it.
Share screen. And wait, what's this? Maybe share. Does it work now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. Thanks, Lisa. She's in the next room, my management forester. Yeah, so this is the so-called rice pond bay. It is about 100 some acres. It was totally in loblolly planted, which probably shouldn't have. but it did pretty well for nearly 40 years. And then Hurricane Florence came, and the bay was totally underwater for over 2 years, and most of the loblolly began dying in there. So we began to salvage it. And you can see this is pretty much the rest after the salvage. You can still see here, this area was always too wet, so we didn't do, it was not salvaged. But especially from here on to the west, all of this, and here in the northern part, we would like to restore that to something. And Jeff Marcus and a lot of other, Jeff, I think you were also there, Jeff Hall. A lot of people were in there and looked at it. And so we are still kind of we don't know exactly what we want to do, but we think we would like to restore it with mostly cypress. So this would be one of our restoration needs. Another need, we are trying to do better around bays, that we stop putting plow lines around bays. That's what the Forest Service did for many years. And we want to get, we definitely don't want to put them in the ecotone zones. One thing I want to mention also, that Bladen Lakes State Forest is not just a conservation forest, but also a production forest. And that means we are totally receipt-based. We do not get any money from the taxpayers. So everything we do in restoration, that money has to come from our forest, from other areas where we need to do production. And so we try to combine that in the best layer we can. Knowledge gaps, quickly to that. Yes, we do have a lot of knowledge gaps, it looks like, on wetlands, and they seem mostly about the hydrology. For example, on this picture you see here right now, like I said, it was over 2 years underwater, and then suddenly the water was gone. So nobody really knows where the water stayed there so long and while it's suddenly gone. So there is a lot we don't know yet about it. We go to the next. Yeah, I just wanted to show you, this is one of the wetlands we want to visit tomorrow. It's a very small one, but we will be in there and walk around. It's totally dry right now. But hopefully that will be a good site. Back. This is the same area we will be visiting tomorrow. This is this little wetland. It's about 2.5 acres, about 500 feet long and 250 feet wide, and we'll be in there. It's just a short walk, should be easy. This is another wetland we would like to restore, or it was half restored. Bill Pickens, our pine silviculturalist, is that the right word? He is retired now. He restored, or he wanted to restore this in Atlantic white cedar, and we did that. It's about 10 acres, and it was split in half. You can see it here, and we did different managements in either side. But it is not really a wetland. The loblolly pine went back in there, and it's mostly like a loblolly stand. And so we are trying now to, with the help, maybe through the NC flood risk reduction, and there is an application, and Vernon Cox, it's the director from Soil and Water Conservation, and professor from ECU, they put an application for a grant in, trying to restore this bay. And so we will see how this will work. It will mostly work with an automated water control structure, which probably would be put down here somewhere or here to restore that wetland. So that's maybe one of hopefully we'll have that accomplished in the next few years. Otherwise, what we have accomplished, we have a bald cypress planted on about 50 acres last year in a wetland. And we had very good survival so far, and we hope this will be a nice accomplishment we'll have. And I think I wait with this for now, and we will talk about Bladen Lakes. I wanted to talk about it tomorrow when we eat for lunch a little bit more about what the forest is, what we do.
All right. Thank you very much, Hans. We did have a question. Do you still sell charcoal at Bladen Lakes?
Yes, we do. But we are out of it right now. We still have to cook some more.
Gotcha. Okay, well, if you don't mind stopping sharing your screen, I'm going to let Jeff Marcus wrap all of this up into one neat package. So much awesome information. I really appreciate all of the speakers today and presenters. Really, really wonderful job by everyone. Yes, Jeff Marcus.
Great. Well, that's exactly what I want to lead with too, is let's, yeah, go ahead and use those emojis out there. Let's give our speakers a virtual round of applause for all their preparation and great work. So thank you for that. Also want to recognize our MC extraordinaire, Jeff Hall, as well as Sarah Hecox and Julian Wilson involved in the planning, and Bob Barden with a lot of the behind the scenes work. So start off with some thanks. Next thing, I just wanted to dispel the misconception that you have to be named Jeff to care about isolated wetlands. We are a much more inclusive community than might initially appear from that. But yeah, in terms of takeaways come from today, I mean, first, I think one that you might get is that it's complicated, and it is. You know, as we heard, there are many different natural communities in a lot of different conditions with a lot of different situations that got them there. It's not always clear what is the right thing to do and how to do it. And the other thing is that it's hard. You know, these systems, you know, I mean, if it was easy, we probably would have gotten a lot of this done already. You know, that you putting fire in there, sometimes it's too wet, sometimes it's too dry. You know, finding the sweet spot for when you can do management and get the right response is difficult. So even though it's hard, it's complicated, I think the other key thing is that it's important. You know, these are really valuable systems, and as Ken, I think, stated, that you know, be patient, take time, and it will get there. And the other thing is that it gets easier. You know, the initial steps in the restoration are usually the hardest. In fact, simply getting off of inertia to think about what needs to be done is probably the hardest of all. As you start moving more into the maintenance phase of this, it is actually much easier to keep up these sites than it is in terms of restoring. So if you have good ones, keep them that way. If you have other ones, you know, the best time to restore these sites was 30 years ago, and the second best time is tomorrow. So yeah, and I guess you know, the final thought there is that even though there's often uncertainty as to what will happen and what is needed, there are experts who are out there. Like Shafley is more than happy to come out. Various, you know, herpetologists, other people who can come and help inform what you have and what could be there. But also, we, in terms of, you know, thinking about what to do, we know what we get with the status quo management. You know, we've seen the trends of declining amphibians and rare plants. We've seen how fewer and fewer of these natural communities seem to be left on the landscape. They weren't always rare. They weren't always unique. You know, the Eastern North Carolina used to be absolutely, you know, covered in them. And so I guess that's the final thought, is that you know, the status quo got us to where we are, and so we need to really shake up and think about what we can be doing more and different and better to help these communities. With that, I'm going to say that those of you who are on the field trip tomorrow, please stick around, and Julian is going to provide us with some logistics. Jeff Hall, any further parting thoughts before to let everyone else sign off?
Just I was going to thank everyone for being here and really appreciate your time.